April 16th, 1945. A calm morning in the Pacific suddenly turns into a scene of chaos and heroism. On the radar picket line north of Okinawa, the crew of the USS Laffey spots dots in the sky that quickly multiply. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft are swarming, intent on turning the destroyer into a fiery wreck. Alarms blare and gunners sprint to their stations. What follows will be remembered as one of the most relentless kamikaze assaults in history. Over the next 80 minutes, Laffey's crew battles a storm of diving planes, machine gun strafing, bombs, and suicide crashes. This is the dramatic story of how the USS Laffey, later nicknamed the ship that would not die, survived an onslaught of 22 kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Okinawa. The USS Laffey was a product of American shipbuilding at its World War II peak, a small but formidable warship built to take on any threat. Often associated with the famous Fletcher-class destroyers, Laffey was in fact an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, an evolutionary design that packed even more firepower and protection. She displaced about 2,200 tons and stretched roughly 376 feet. Twin-geared steam turbines propelled her to speeds up to 34 knots, making her fast enough to keep up with aircraft carriers or chase down submarines. What truly set Laffey apart was her armament and cutting-edge equipment, critical for the intense battles of late World War II. She bristled with weapons on every deck, 6 5-inch dual-purpose guns mounted in 3 enclosed turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft, capable of engaging enemy ships or hurling shells high at attacking aircraft. For close-range air defense, Laffey was outfitted with an array of rapid-firing anti-aircraft guns, 12 40mm Bofors cannons in twin mounts, and 11 20mm Oerlikon cannons. These automatic weapons could throw up curtains of flak and tracers, a vital shield against dive bombers and kamikazes. In addition to sheer firepower, Laffey featured improved radar and fire control systems, reflecting her role as a radar picket and fighter director ship. Powerful air search radar could detect incoming raids from dozens of miles away, providing early warning, a capability that would soon prove life-saving. Her crew of around 336 officers and sailors was well trained to operate this complex destroyer, having already seen action in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Commissioned in February 1944, Laffey had participated in the D-Day invasion of Normandy, where she provided naval gunfire support and survived a hit from a German shore battery. The shell struck, but miraculously failed to explode. By 1945, the destroyer was repaired, upgraded, and sent to the Pacific War Zone with battle experience under her belt. In short, USS Laffey was a fast, agile, and heavily armed tin can, built to escort larger ships, screen against aircraft and submarines, and if necessary, stand in harm's way to protect the fleet. Little did her crew know just how brutally that capability would be tested off Okinawa. In the spring of 1945, the United States Navy and Marine Corps were fighting their way toward Japan's home islands. The Battle of Okinawa, which began in April, was the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, and it provoked a desperate response from Japan. Waves of kamikaze, suicide aircraft, were thrown against the Allied fleet in massive coordinated attacks. These raids sought to shatter the invasion fleet by overwhelming it with swarms of pilots willing to die. The duty of blunting these attacks often fell to the destroyers posted on the fringes of the fleet as radar picket ships. USS Laffey, assigned to perhaps the most exposed position of all, Radar Picket Station 1, about 30 miles north of Okinawa. Radar picket duty was vital but perilous. Laffey's advanced radar allowed her to spot enemy planes and warn the fleet, but it also made her a prime target for kamikaze attacks. She had minimal support, only a few smaller gunboats, while facing these dangers far from the main fleet. On April 15, 1945, the day before the Great Attack, Laffey had already tasted combat at her picket station. A formation of enemy planes probed her sector, and the destroyer's gunners, now well practiced, managed to shoot down several attackers, they had credited at least 13 enemy aircraft destroyed on April 15th. The crew remained on high alert, knowing that an even larger assault could be on the horizon. Their nerves were tested, but their confidence was bolstered. Laffey's guns and crew had performed admirably so far. Still, the seasoned captain, Commander Frederick J. Beckton, understood the danger mounting. Reports from other picket stations indicated that the Japanese were organizing an unprecedented airborne onslaught. Laffey's crew spent a tense night at general quarters, ammunition at the ready, gun crews rotating watch. Dawn of April 16th arrived with uneasy calm. No one could have imagined that by mid-morning, their lone destroyer would be fighting for its life against an aerial ambush of overwhelming proportions. Shortly after 8 a.m. on April 16th, lookouts aboard USS Laffey spotted a lone Val dive bomber. The destroyer's guns opened fire, forcing the plane to jettison its bomb and withdraw. Within minutes, 4 more Vals appeared, signaling the beginning of the full kamikaze assault. The crew braced themselves as the quartet of enemy dive bombers split into pairs to execute a pincer attack. 2 Vals screamed down in steep dives toward Laffey's bow from starboard, while the other 2 approached from astern. The sky erupted with tracers as Laffey's dual-purpose 5-inch guns swung up, and her 40mm Bofors batteries began pumping out shells at a furious rate. The forward attackers met a wall of steel. 1 Val was blown apart in mid-air by bursts from the 40mm, and another took intense 20mm fire from Laffey's portside gunners, causing it to spin out of control and splash into the sea short of the ship. From the stern, the remaining 2 dive bombers came racing in. Gunners on the aft 5-inch turret and nearby 20mm guns concentrated fire on the 3rd Val. Under the combined barrage, pieces of the aircraft peeled off. Its fixed landing gear was seen cartwheeling away as the plane, mortally hit, lost lift, and skidded into the ocean just behind Laffey, throwing up a plume of water. The 4th Val, however, managed to slip through the gauntlet. With engine roaring and nose pointed directly at Laffey's stern, it refused to be shaken. The aft gunners kept shooting, punching holes in the dive bomber's wings and fuselage, but the damaged plane kept coming. At the last moment, just as it neared the ship, the Val wavered, perhaps already in flames or out of control. It crashed into the sea only a few yards away, a near miss, but not harmless. In its final moments, the kamikaze had released its bomb. The force was enough to knock crewmen off their feet and jam the ship's rudder to port, effectively crippling Laffey's steering. Though narrowly spared a direct hit, Laffey was now partially maimed. She could only steer in a circle unless the rudder could be freed, and the battle had only begun. More enemy planes dove in, Judy and Val bombers from multiple directions. With the rudder jammed, Laffey's survival now depended solely on her guns and crew. 1 Judy lined up for a strafing run on Laffey's port beam. As it swept in low, its forward machine guns blinking, Laffey's port 20mm cannons tracked it. Tracers converged and ripped into the Judy's engine. A moment later, it erupted in flames and cartwheeled into the waves, never getting a chance to release its bomb. 10 seconds later, another D4Y screamed in from the starboard side, diving fast in a classic bombing profile. Laffey's 5-inch gunners took aim and fired salvo after salvo. Just as the enemy released its bomb, a direct hit from Laffey's main battery blew the D4Y apart, but its 500-pound bomb, though released haphazardly, still fell toward the destroyer. By sheer luck, this bomb plunged into the water just off the starboard side and exploded underwater, sparing Laffey a catastrophic hit, but spraying shrapnel that tore into the starboard gun crews. Several sailors on the 40mm mounts were wounded by the razor-sharp fragments, but they stayed at their posts, bloodied yet determined to keep firing. Now, multiple kamikaze Vals were diving in succession. At 8:42, 1 Val came hurtling down toward Laffey's portside. The ship's gunners zeroed in and managed to blast it apart moments before impact. The disintegrating plane clipped the edge of the deck in a glancing blow and then plunged into the sea, its wreckage spewing burning aviation fuel across part of the deck. Sailors instinctively hit the deck or ducked as flaming debris skittered by, but they sprang up to continue the fight. Almost immediately, another Val screamed down. Laffey's gunners couldn't stop this one in time. The kamikaze crashed directly onto one of the ship's 40mm gun mounts on the port side. There was a deafening explosion as the plane's fuel and bomb turned that section of the deck into an inferno. The 40mm mount was obliterated, and 3 crewmen there were killed instantly. Several nearby guns were knocked out of commission, and fires began to lick at ammunition stored nearby. As damage control teams rushed to douse the flames and prevent the blaze from reaching the magazine, yet another attacker was already diving out of the sun. Another D-3A kamikaze came from astern in a shallow glide, guns blazing. Mount 53 tracked it and fired continuously even as the enemy plane grew larger in their sights. In a sickening instant, the Val crashed directly onto that aft 5-inch turret. The impact and the plane's bomb detonated the powder stored in the gun mount, erupting in a fireball that blew the turret apart. A huge chunk of Laffey's stern superstructure was now a flaming wreck, with a gaping hole where the 5-inch gun mount had been. Sailors in that section were hurled by the blast or killed outright. The scene was carnage, with smoke, flame, and twisted metal. A split second later, yet another kamikaze, incredibly, a 4th Val in a row, aimed for the same aft section, perhaps trying to exploit the destruction. This plane came in from almost directly astern, skimming low over the water. Laffey's rear guns were reeling from the previous hit, but a few surviving gunners on adjacent mounts sprayed bullets at the incoming aircraft. They managed to set its left wing on fire, but momentum carried the doomed plane forward. It smashed into the already burning aft gun area in a shower of sparks, adding its own wreckage to the blaze. The back of the ship was now an inferno, and Laffey was beginning to list slightly from flooding and all the violent blows she'd sustained. Despite the hellish scene, the remaining gun crews kept up their barrage, and Laffey's bridge was still intact, with Captain Becton and his officers orchestrating the defense. The captain knew they needed help. The sheer number of enemy planes was overwhelming. Thankfully, the Navy had foreseen that radar picket ships might be attacked by swarms too large to handle alone. Earlier, a call for assistance had been sent out, and now help arrived in the nick of time from above. 4 Wildcat fighters roared onto the scene, dispatched from the escort carrier USS Shamrock Bay on patrol. These Wildcat fighters dove straight into the knot of enemy aircraft attacking Laffey. One Wildcat pilot, Lieutenant Carl Riemann, plunged his stubby fighter into the fray with guns blazing. He latched onto the tail of an incoming Val and blasted it out of the sky before it could line up on Laffey. Riemann's wingman chased another kamikaze and sent it spiraling down in flames. The Allied fighters created momentary confusion among the attackers, forcing some to break off their suicide runs to dogfight. Riemann quickly acquired a 3rd target, a Kate torpedo bomber that was sweeping in low, possibly also loaded with a bomb for a kamikaze dive. A burst of .50 caliber bullets tore through the Kate's cockpit, and it crashed into the waves with its pilot already dead. In rapid succession, Riemann damaged a 2nd Kate as well, emptying his ammunition into it. With no bullets left, the Wildcat pilots did not leave the battle. Instead, they began making high-speed dummy runs at the kamikazes, diving past them to startle or distract the enemy pilots. These bold passes threw off the aim of several attackers. The Wildcats stayed until their fuel ran low, then reluctantly returned to base, having downed or deterred multiple enemies. Hot on their heels, a squadron of 12 Marine Corps Corsair fighters swept in to continue the cavalry charge. The sky was now filled not only with Japanese planes, but also American blue-painted fighters twisting and climbing in dogfights. The Corsairs, faster and more heavily armed than the Wildcats, aggressively targeted the remaining kamikazes. One Corsair chased a Val dive bomber that was lining up on Laffey's port side. Under pressure, That kamikaze pilot released his bomb early and missed. The Corsair pounced and shot the D-3A down moments later, sending it crashing into the sea well clear of the ship. Another Corsair spotted an approaching Oscar Army fighter that was streaking in for a strafing run on Laffey's starboard side. The Oscar's nose guns were twinkling as it bore down, bullets stitching the water and hull, but one of Laffey's own gunners, manning a 20mm cannon despite the chaos, drew a bead and hit the Oscar at the last second. The enemy fighter wobbled and, unable to control its dive, smashed into Laffey's mast structure, tearing through radar antennas before cartwheeling into the ocean. Tragically, in this wild sequence, the pursuing Corsair also collided with part of Laffey's superstructure during the frenzied maneuver. The Corsair pilot managed to eject or was thrown clear as his plane clipped the ship. The fighter tumbled into the sea. Crewmen on Laffey cheered in relief as they saw the downed American pilot bob to the surface on his life raft, and one of the little support craft, LCS-51, sped through splashes of battle to pluck the flyer from the water. Even amid the life and death struggle, the Laffey's crew took heart knowing their allies were literally falling out of the sky to help them. The battle raged on around the shattered destroyer. A fresh Val dove out of a cloud. A Corsair throttled up in pursuit, peppering the Val from behind. Under this pressure, the kamikaze pilot lost his angle and overshot the destroyer, the plane hurtling by without hitting its target. As the Val tried to circle back, the Corsair caught it with another burst and sent it crashing down. But targets were everywhere. Another Val managed to break through and began a dive from the stern, releasing its bomb as it passed over Laffey. The bomb exploded off the port quarter, jolting the ship yet again and adding more holes to her already punctured hull. That attacker was soon dispatched by a swooping Corsair. In quick succession, a second Val lined up and dropped another bomb on Laffey. This time, a direct hit on a 40mm gun mount on the starboard side. The explosion annihilated the gun mount and its crew, dealing yet another grievous blow to Laffey's defensive guns. It was now sheer endurance. Laffey had fewer and fewer guns operational, many sections aflame, and casualties mounting, but still, she had not gone down. Corsairs and ship's guns together took out another pair of Oscar fighters attempting to come in from the bow. One Oscar went down in flames to a Corsair's guns. The second Oscar, enraged, shot that Corsair down moments later, but as the triumphant Oscar streaked onward, Laffey's forward 5-inch battery locked on and, with a thunderous volley, blasted the Oscar out of the sky in retribution. By now, the air attack was reaching its final throes. The Japanese had thrown everything at Radar Picket Station 1. Roughly 22 aircraft in all had engaged Laffey in this running battle, and the picket destroyer was battered, burning, and listing. Yet a few last attackers still tried to finish her off. One Val came diving toward the ship's starboard beam. In a remarkable display of precision, and perhaps desperation, Laffey's forward 5-inch gun operators managed to train their turret on the diving plane and score a direct hit right on the nose of the aircraft. The kamikaze disintegrated before it could ever crash into the ship, its bomb detonating harmlessly in mid-air. Finally, one last Judy attempted to swoop in for a kill. Before it could dive, however, 2 Corsairs pounced on it. One of the Marine pilots emptied his guns into the Judy, sending it spiraling away, trailing smoke. The surviving Japanese pilots began to disengage. By around 9:30 and 9:45, the furious attack subsided as the remnants of the kamikaze force either were shot down or retreated. A thick pall of black smoke hung over the USS Laffey. Her decks were strewn with debris, pieces of wings and tail assemblies, unexploded ordnance, and the charred remnants of gun mounts. Fires still smouldered in several compartments. Many crew members were wounded, and too many of their shipmates lay fallen amid the wreckage. But miraculously, Laffey was still afloat, and her remaining crew were in control of their ship. In total, the destroyer had sustained hits from 6 kamikaze crashes and 4 bomb strikes, plus multiple strafing runs. Of the 22 hostile aircraft that attacked, by some estimates, Laffey's gunners, with crucial help from the Wildcats and Corsairs, had shot down at least 9 or more of them during the battle. It was an extraordinary feat of collective heroism and gunnery skill. In the hours that followed, the crew fought a second battle against fire, flooding, and exhaustion. Engineering teams kept the pumps running as the ship listed from water entering through bomb holes. Fire parties cooled the deck plates above the aft magazine, aware that one wrong spark could finish what the kamikazes had begun. They saved her with discipline and instinct, improvising repairs until power returned and the ship steadied. By midday, on April 16, 1945, the worst of the fires were out. Laffey's hull was pitted and bent, but she was still a fighting ship. Limping back to Okinawa under her own power and defiance, Laffey's toll of battle was realized. 32 men dead, 71 wounded. Yet the destroyer's stand had become an inspiration throughout the fleet. Word spread fast. The picket ship that faced 20-plus suicide planes and countless others did not go down. Admiral Raymond Spruance called it one of the bravest actions of the Pacific War. Within weeks, the Navy awarded Laffey the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism against overwhelming odds. Captain Frederick J. Beckton received the Navy Cross, and dozens of officers and crew were decorated for their actions under fire. For Laffey, her scars became proof of endurance: 6 kamikaze hits, 4 bomb strikes, and still she returned to port. Laffey's survival reinforced the Navy's faith in destroyer design, crew training, and the willpower of sailors who refused to yield. To the men who fought on her decks, survival was victory enough. To the rest of the fleet, she became a symbol, a reminder that even amid the most desperate moments of Okinawa, courage and discipline could hold the line. The dramatic defense of USS Laffey against waves of kamikaze attackers will forever be remembered as a testament to the indomitable spirit of her crew and the ship that simply refused to sink. March 1944, the Indian Ocean. Smoke drifts over the waves as the Japanese heavy cruiser Tone closes on the burning British freighter Behar. Survivors cling to lifeboats, expecting rescue from the grey-hulled warship now looming above them. Instead, rifles are raised. What follows will become one of the most notorious atrocities committed by a Japanese surface ship in World War II, an act that stains a vessel already marked by years of service from Pearl Harbor to Leyte Gulf. This is the story of IJN Tone, a cruiser built for reconnaissance and victory that ended her career in disgrace and destruction. From the Behar incident to her final bombardment in 1945, Tone's name would come to symbolize both Japan's ambition and the moral collapse of its navy in defeat. IJN Tone was conceived in the 1930s as Japan expanded its fleet under loosening naval treaties. Laid down in 1934 and commissioned in late 1938, Tone was the lead ship of a new 2-vessel Tone class of heavy cruisers. Unlike earlier designs, Tone's main battery of 8 203mm 8-inch guns was mounted entirely forward of the bridge in 4 twin turrets. This unique layout left the stern open for an enlarged aircraft deck and up to 6 floatplane reconnaissance seaplanes. The concept was to create a fast scout cruiser that could range ahead of the fleet, spotting enemy forces and directing Japan's powerful battleships and carriers. Tone and her sister, Chikuma, were among the Imperial Japanese Navy's most advanced cruisers, blending firepower, speed, and extensive scouting capability. By the time Tone slid into the water at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki shipyard, she embodied Japan's determination to command the seas with cutting-edge warships. From the outset of the Pacific War, IJN Tone was at the forefront of Japan's naval offensives. As part of Cruiser Division 8 with Chikuma, Tone supported the Pearl Harbor strike on the 7th of December 1941 by launching a floatplane for pre-raid reconnaissance over Oahu. In early 1942, she operated in the Java Sea campaign and helped sink the US destroyer USS Edsall, demonstrating her long-range gunnery. Tone then joined the Indian Ocean raid of April 1942, screening Japan's carrier force during attacks on British bases and shipping. Throughout 1942, she served as an eye of the fleet in major battles, including Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, where her scouting aircraft searched for enemy ships. By 1943, Tone continued to patrol and escort, though Japan's naval fortunes were waning. In early 1944, her role shifted to commerce raiding. Under Operation SA No. 1, a long-range Indian Ocean mission, Tone and 2 other cruisers struck Allied shipping along the Fremantle-Colombo route. During this operation, in March 1944, Tone would become entangled in a notorious incident at sea. Later that year, the cruiser was assigned to Japan's main fleet for the defense of the Philippines. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, Tone was part of Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, though the Japanese carriers suffered a crushing defeat. A few months later, Tone saw action in the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944. There, in the Battle off Samar, she engaged the US Taffy 3 escort carrier group. Tone's 8-inch guns helped cripple the escort carrier USS Kalinin Bay and scored a hit on USS Fanshawe Bay while under attack from determined American aircraft and destroyers. Despite taking 2 bomb hits, one a dud and one damaging her steering, Tone survived the Samar engagement and retreated with the remnants of Japan's fleet. By the end of 1944, however, Japan's surviving heavy ships were short on fuel and relegated mostly to port. Tone's active combat role was over, setting the stage for her final chapter as the war neared its end. One of the darkest episodes involving IJN Tone occurred during her commerce raiding sortie in the Indian Ocean. On the 9th of March 1944, Tone, under Captain Haruo Mayuzumi, and accompanying cruisers Aoba and Chikuma, encountered the British merchant ship MV Bihar in the open Indian Ocean, roughly midway between Australia and Ceylon. The 6,000-ton steamer Bihar was sailing from Australia toward India, carrying cargo and civilian passengers. Upon sighting the enemy ship, Tone signaled Bihar to stop. The freighter attempted to flee and sent a distress radio message, prompting Tone to open fire with her big guns. Within minutes, Bihar was struck in the bow and stern, forcing the crew and passengers to abandon ship. As Bihar sank, lifeboats and survivors were left adrift. Tone's crew proceeded to capture the survivors, ultimately hauling over 100 people out of the water and lifeboats and onto the cruiser. Accounts indicate this was not a gentle rescue. Some lifeboats may have been rammed, and there were reports of Japanese sailors machine gunning survivors in the water before picking up those who remained alive. Around 108 survivors from Bihar, including merchant crew, British naval gunners, and a few civilian women, were taken prisoner aboard IJN Tone. The treatment of these captives was brutal from the start. Upon being brought on deck, the prisoners were stripped of valuables, and many had their arms tightly bound behind their backs. Under the tropical sun, the bound survivors sat or lay on the open deck for hours, struggling to breathe. Any protest was met with violence. When Bihar's chief officer objected that such abuse of civilians violated the Geneva Convention, he was beaten by sailors. Eventually, the captives were moved below decks into cramped, sweltering storage compartments. There, they received minimal food or water, with poor ventilation and sanitation, for the next several days as Tone steamed northwest toward Japanese-held Java. Meanwhile, Tone's captain, Mayuzumi, notified his squadron commander of the day's action. The raid's overall commander, Rear Admiral Naomasa Sakonju, was aboard the flagship Aoba. Sakonju had standing orders for this operation. Any Allied merchant seamen captured were to be killed, except a few specialists, like radio operators, or officers who might have intelligence value. Upon learning that Tone had not only failed to capture the Bihar intact, but also taken over 100 survivors, Sakonju grew alarmed and angry. He signaled a sharp rebuke to Mayuzumi for picking up so many unnecessary prisoners. The admiral ordered Tone to dispose of the excess survivors, reiterating that only a handful should be kept for interrogation. Captain Mayuzumi found himself in a moral and military dilemma. He was personally reluctant to carry out wholesale executions. A devout Christian, Mayuzumi reportedly felt that killing unarmed civilians and shipwrecked sailors violated his beliefs and the code of conduct. His executive officer, Commander Junsuke Mii, likewise opposed murdering the prisoners. Mayuzumi first tried to delay and quietly resist the order. He requested permission to offload the captives at the nearest port, arguing they could be held as POWs instead. But this request was flatly rejected by Admiral Sekonju. Determined, Mayuzumi went in person to meet Sekonju when their ships regrouped to plead on the prisoners' behalf. The admiral, however, was unmoved. He curtly told Mayuzumi to obey my orders. Facing a direct command from his superior, and on the 15th of March 1944, Tone and the other raiding cruisers arrived at Tanjung Priok, the port of Batavia in Japanese-occupied Java. Here, a partial reprieve occurred for some of Behar's people. The Japanese selected a small group of prisoners to be taken off the ship alive. Sources differ on the exact number, but roughly 30 to 35 survivors, including Behar's captain, Captain Maurice Simons, other senior officers, and the 2 women passengers, were transferred to Admiral Sekonju's flagship and put ashore in Java as POWs. These individuals were considered the useful prisoners for intelligence or propaganda and were spared immediate execution. After refueling and reprovisioning, on the 18th of March, the cruisers departed Java bound for Singapore. It was now, in the open sea away from scrutiny, that the grim orders were finally carried out. On the night of the 18th to the 19th of March 1944, somewhere in the Java Sea, the crew of Tone systematically executed the remaining Behar survivors. Approximately 69 unarmed prisoners, the remaining men from the merchant crew and military gunners, were brought up from below, one by one, or in small groups. Several of Tone's junior officers, likely under orders and armed with swords, carried out the killings. Captain Mayuzumi stood on the bridge watching as his men put the captives to death. Notably, his second-in-command, Commander Mii, refused to participate in the executions. By the end of this night of brutality, all of the captured Behar survivors remaining on Tone had been killed and their bodies likely cast into the sea. Only those few dozen individuals offloaded in Java survived the incident. What came to be known as the Behar Massacre resulted in the murder of nearly 70 shipwreck survivors, a clear war crime and a rare instance of an Imperial Japanese Navy surface ship executing mass prisoners. The Japanese cruiser force arrived in Singapore about a week later, having sunk only one merchant ship in the operation, but indelibly staining Tone's service record with an atrocity. In early 1945, IJN Tone was a fleet unit in name only. After temporary fixes, she spent the final months of the war mostly stationary. The cruiser entered dry dock in Japan, Maizuru Naval Arsenal, for full repairs and modifications. By February 1945, Tone was restored to fighting condition and fitted with additional anti-aircraft guns and radar upgrades. However, chronic fuel shortages and the dire strategic situation kept her from going to sea again for combat operations. Instead, Tone was moored in Etajima Bay near the naval base of Kure and repurposed as a training ship and floating anti-air defense. On the 19th of March 1945, US carrier aircraft raided near the naval base of Kure. Tone was only lightly damaged by strafing or near misses in that attack. As spring turned to summer, the once formidable cruiser lay camouflaged at anchor, awaiting a final blow. That final blow came in late July 1945, when the Allies launched massive airstrikes to neutralize the remaining Japanese naval forces. On July 24, 1945, as part of a coordinated series of raids on Kure and the Inland Sea, Task Force 38 sent waves of carrier aircraft to attack warships in the harbour. IJN Tone was moored in Etajima Bay alongside other idle vessels. 9 dive bombers from the USS Monterey targeted Tone. Despite whatever token anti-aircraft fire her crew could muster, the cruiser took at least 3 direct bomb hits. Explosions tore through her deck and upper works, and within a short time, Tone began to settle by the stern. The shallow bay prevented a total plunge. Instead, the proud cruiser sank to the harbour floor, resting in the mud with part of her structure above water. Over the next days, additional attacks ensured she was completely wrecked. Carrier planes from USS Wasp, Bataan, and Ticonderoga strafed the hulk of Tone, while other bombers dropped more armour-piercing bombs on any identifiable ships. These strikes left Tone gutted and inert, a burning hulk amid the harbour wreckage. By the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945, IJN Tone lay ruined, sunk in port without ever having sailed on her final mission. The Imperial Japanese Navy officially struck Tone from its register in November 1945. In the immediate post-war years, salvage crews raised what remained of the cruiser from Itajima Bay. The once fearsome warship was broken up for scrap metal by 1948, her steel recycled rather than preserved. Yet the legacy of IJN Tone lives on in historical records, not for her combat victories, but for the notorious crime committed under her flag. The Behar incident became a case study in wartime atrocity. After Japan's defeat, Allied authorities investigated numerous Japanese war crimes, including the massacre of the Behar survivors. In 1947, a British military tribunal in Hong Kong put Rear Admiral Naomasa Sakonju and Captain Haruo Mayuzumi on trial for the unlawful killings. Both men were convicted. Admiral Sakonju, as the officer who ordered the executions, was sentenced to death and hanged in 1948. Captain Mayuzumi, who had carried out the order, albeit reluctantly, received a prison sentence, 7 years imprisonment, rather than execution. The court noted his attempts to spare lives, but he was still held responsible for following a blatantly illegal command. Other crew involved were also tried or interrogated, though Sakonju and Mayuzumi bore the chief blame. The survivors of those few Behar prisoners who were left in Java endured the war in POW camps and were liberated in 1945, providing testimony to what had happened aboard Tone. The Behar massacre stands as one of the most egregious war crimes at sea during World War II, a grim reminder of how the laws of war were violated in desperate times. Tone is remembered as a warship of contradictions, a well-engineered cruiser that served with distinction in several battles, yet forever associated with a horrific atrocity. Her story, from innovative design and early war exploits to the war crime and her ultimate destruction, illustrates the tragic extremes of naval warfare in the Pacific. A formation of Imperial Japanese Navy carriers plows through calm waters, bristling with aircraft poised for battle. Aboard Shōkaku, flight deck crews scramble to refuel and rearm returning planes, unaware of the danger lurking below. Suddenly, the hull shudders. 3 torpedo impacts rip open Shōkaku's bow. Within moments, thick black smoke billows from the carrier's hangar deck as aviation fuel ignites into a raging inferno. Alarms echo through the ship, and sailors fight to contain the flames, but Shōkaku is mortally wounded. With one last thunderous roar from exploding fuel vapors, Shōkaku slips beneath the surface, taking over 1,200 of her crew with her. This is the story of Shōkaku, a vessel that embodied the peak of Japanese carrier design, from her triumphs at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea to her final destruction in the Philippine Sea. Commissioned in August 1941, IJN Shōkaku represented a new generation of Japanese aircraft carriers built on the eve of World War II. Freed from earlier naval treaty limits, Japan had poured its latest technology and experience into Shōkaku's design. At about 844 feet long and displacing over 32,000 tons at full load, she was significantly larger and more robust than pre-war carriers. Shōkaku's power came from 4 steam turbine engines producing 160,000 shaft horsepower, driving her to a swift 34-knot top speed, an impressive pace that allowed her to keep up with the fastest fleet units. With a range of 9,700 nautical miles at cruising speed, she could roam the vast Pacific and project air power far from home ports. Shōkaku's design balanced speed, range, and protection. Her builders incorporated unusually heavy armor for an aircraft carrier, reflecting lessons from earlier carrier battles. Vital areas, machinery spaces, aviation fuel tanks, and magazines were shielded by armor up to 8.5 inches thick in places. A strengthened armored deck and belt gave Shōkaku a fighting chance to survive bomb hits that might devastate a lesser ship. This protection would prove crucial in keeping her afloat during several ferocious battles to come. Above the armored hull stretched a full-length flight deck, nearly 795 feet long, serviced by 3 deck elevators linking 2 hangar levels below. This efficient layout allowed Shōkaku to operate a large air group, about 72 operational aircraft plus spares, one of the highest carrier complements of the time. On the eve of war in 1941, her typical air wing included a potent mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. For example, 18 Zero fighters, 27 Val dive bombers, and 27 Kate torpedo bombers were embarked for the Pearl Harbor operation. This balance of aircraft types gave Shōkaku both a formidable offensive punch and a defensive fighter screen. To defend herself, Shōkaku was armed with an array of anti-aircraft guns. Along her flanks were 8 twin-mounted 5-inch dual-purpose guns, capable of firing high-explosive shells at attacking aircraft or engaging enemy ships. For close-range defense, she carried at least 12 triple mounts of 25mm anti-air guns, 36 barrels initially, with more added later in the war. These light guns could put up a dense flak screen, though they suffered from problems like slow training and frequent reloading. By 1944, Shōkaku's anti-aircraft suite had been augmented considerably, reflecting the increasingly dire air threat. She was also among the first Japanese carriers fitted with air search radar, a Type 21 set, by late 1942, a noteworthy technological improvement that would later help alert her crew to incoming air attacks. However, one design issue lurked unseen. Like all pre-war Japanese carriers, Shōkaku's aviation gasoline tanks were built into the hull structure without the protective enclosures used in some Allied designs. This meant that shock from bombs and torpedoes could crack fuel tanks and spread flammable vapors inside the ship. After the carrier disasters at Midway, the Japanese tried to mitigate this by pumping inert gas or even pouring concrete around empty fuel spaces. But, as Shōkaku's final moments would demonstrate, these measures were not enough to prevent fuel vapor explosions once damage occurred. In all, Shōkaku was a formidable fleet carrier. Fast, well-armed, with a large air group and unusually strong construction. She would soon put all of these qualities to the test. Shōkaku entered service in mid-1941 as the lead ship of Japan's 5th Carrier Division, alongside her sister Zuikaku. She immediately joined Vice Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai, participating in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Her air group struck US warships and facilities in the second wave, returning home unscathed and heralded as part of Japan's new striking arm. In early 1942, Shōkaku's aircraft supported operations across the Pacific, from Rabaul to the Indian Ocean raid, where her squadrons helped sink the British cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire and the carrier Hermes. By May, she was part of Operation MO, Japan's push toward Port Moresby, leading to the Battle of the Coral Sea, the world's first carrier-versus-carrier engagement. Shōkaku's aircrews helped cripple USS Lexington, but in return, US Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown hit Shōkaku with 3 1,000-pound bombs, tearing open her flight deck and killing over 100 crewmen. She barely survived the storm-tossed voyage back to Japan for repairs. The damage kept her out of the Battle of Midway, sparing her from the disaster that destroyed 4 other Japanese carriers. Once repaired, Shōkaku returned to action at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, where her planes damaged Enterprise, but the battle ended indecisively. 2 months later, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, her air group helped sink Hornet, though Shōkaku herself was hit by several bombs. Thanks to improved radar and new safety measures that drained aviation fuel lines before battle, her crew prevented the fires from reaching her magazines, a feat of damage control that saved the ship. After extensive repairs at Kure, Shōkaku operated from Truk Lagoon through 1943, one of the few veteran carriers still afloat, and saw limited action as Japan's carrier strength dwindled. By early 1944, Shōkaku and Zuikaku were among the last first-line carriers available, veterans of nearly every major engagement from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, and the core of what remained of the Imperial Navy's carrier force. In early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy consolidated its remaining carrier strength for a decisive defense of the homeland's inner perimeter. Shōkaku and her sister, Zuikaku, were sent to the Linga Islands, south of Singapore, in the spring of 1944 to train and await action. This forward location also put them closer to sources of fuel oil, which were growing scarce in Japan. By June, US forces began their assault on the Mariana Islands, the invasion of Saipan on June 15, 1944, threatening Japan's inner defense line. The Japanese High Command activated Operation Eigo, a plan to mass the mobile fleet and counterattack the US Navy in a decisive battle. Shōkaku departed Linga with Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's 1st Mobile Fleet on June 15, 1944, joining a formidable armada of 9 carriers, including the brand new carrier Taiho as flagship, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Steaming through the Philippines, the fleet refueled and then headed northeast toward the Mariana Islands, determined to engage the US carrier task forces in what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Ozawa's battle plan was ambitious: launch massive waves of carrier aircraft at the US fleet from long range, while also coordinating strikes from land-based air units in the Marianas. The goal was to overwhelm the Americans, sink their carriers, and halt the US advance. By June 18, 1944, Shōkaku and the Mobile Fleet were in position west of the Marianas. Early on June 19th, Japanese reconnaissance located the US Fifth Fleet, and Ozawa ordered his carriers to launch their first attacks. Shōkaku's decks roared to life that morning as she launched multiple squadrons of Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters, part of a series of complex strike waves hurled toward the enemy fleet. The departing aircraft left Shōkaku with a relatively small reserve aboard, as most of her air group was in the air or had been dispatched. The ensuing aerial battles on June 19th would earn the day the nickname Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. US Navy fighters and anti-aircraft guns slaughtered the incoming Japanese planes with minimal losses. Shōkaku's air groups suffered terribly. Still, some of her aviators distinguished themselves. A group of Shōkaku's veteran dive bomber pilots, many of whom had fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, managed to break through the American defenses. In a rare success that day, one of Shōkaku's D-4 Waisuisei dive bombers scored a bomb hit on the battleship USS South Dakota, causing damage and casualties to the American crew. It was a small revenge for the ship that had been repeatedly battered by US Dauntlesses in earlier battles. But such victories were few. By noon, the Japanese carrier air groups had been decimated, with hundreds of planes shot down across the fleet. As Shōkaku recovered the surviving aircraft from the morning strikes, the ship's crew also faced another invisible threat. American submarines, deployed in a scouting line, had been tracking the Japanese fleet's approach. Earlier that same morning, the brand new carrier, Taiho, sailing not far from Shōkaku, was struck by a torpedo from the USS Albacore. The damage to Taiho initially seemed contained, but gasoline vapors gathered and later ignited in a catastrophic explosion, sinking Japan's flagship around midday. Unaware of Taiho's impending doom, Shōkaku's crew remained focused on their own operations. By late morning, Shōkaku was slightly isolated at the rear of Ozawa's formation, intent on recovering aircraft and readying a possible second wave. At 11:20 on June 19, 1944, the US submarine USS Kavala, commanded by Commander Herman J. Kostler, penetrated the screen of Shōkaku's task group. Kavala had been vectored into the area just hours before, and now the submarine's periscope tracked Shōkaku's enormous grey hull cutting through the sea. Kostler maneuvered into an attack position undetected. At 11:22, Kavala fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier. Shōkaku's lookouts spotted telltale tracks frothing toward them too late. Within seconds, 3 or 4 torpedoes slammed into Shōkaku's starboard side in rapid succession. One torpedo exploded forward on the starboard bow, near where ordnance was stored, and others struck along the hull amidships. The blows were devastating. A tremendous geyser of water and debris rose alongside Shōkaku as the explosions tore open her compartments. Inside the carrier, the effect was immediate and calamitous. The forward hit caused heavy flooding in the bow, and Shōkaku began to settle by the bow almost at once. Other torpedoes ripped into the hangar and machinery spaces, knocking out generators and starting fires in the hangar deck. Worse still, Shōkaku was in the middle of refueling and rearming operations for her aircraft when the torpedoes struck. Fuel hoses had been rigged, and ammunition was exposed on the hangar deck as crews hurried to turn around the returning planes. The torpedo impacts ruptured fuel lines and hurled fuel carts into the air, spraying volatile aviation gasoline throughout the hangar. Within minutes, multiple fires raged out of control, fed by the leaking gas. Black smoke poured from the stricken carrier as firefighting crews fought in vain to contain the blaze. The ship rapidly developed a list as seawater flooded her starboard side. On the flight deck, sailors desperately pushed surviving aircraft overboard to eliminate fuel loads and tried to smother flames with foam, but the inferno spread with frightening speed. Amid the chaos, Shōkaku's captain, Matsubara Hiroshi, realized the ship was in grave peril. By noon, Shōkaku was low in the water forward. The order was given to abandon ship as explosions rattled the carrier's interior. At around 12:10 p.m., a colossal blast blew Shōkaku apart from within. One of the fires had detonated either a stockpile of bombs in the hangar or the forward magazine, and the resulting explosion ignited accumulated gasoline vapors, creating a devastating chain reaction. Witnesses on other ships saw a fireball and pieces of flight deck hurled high above the carrier. Within minutes, the soaring crane was done for. Shōkaku rapidly sank bow first, her ensign still flying, and slipped under the waves of the Philippine Sea. The sinking was swift, giving crew members topside little time to get clear. Hundreds of men were trapped below as the carrier went down. Shōkaku's demise was catastrophic in human terms. Of a complement of around 1,660 plus air group personnel and officers, an estimated 1,272 men went down with the ship. This toll included hundreds of skilled aviators and deck crew, as well as 8 civilians, technicians and journalists attached to the fleet. Captain Matsubara was among those who managed to abandon ship at the last moments. He, along with 570 survivors, were plucked from the oil-stained water by the nearby cruiser Yahagi and destroyers Urakazi, Wakatsuki, and Hatsuzuki. These rescue ships managed to save less than 1/4 of Shōkaku's crew. The rest, nearly 3/4 of her company, perished inside the carrier or in the sea. Meanwhile, USS Kavala, having scored a fatal blow on its first war patrol, endured a vicious depth charging from escorting destroyers. Though shaken and damaged, the submarine slipped away, later surfacing to confirm by radio the sinking of a large Japanese carrier. For this action, Kavala's crew earned a Presidential Unit Citation, while the Imperial Japanese Navy mourned the loss of one of its finest flat tops. With Shōkaku and Taiho both sunk on June 19th, Vice Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet was left with only a handful of operational carriers, Zuikaku and a few smaller carriers, for the second day of battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea concluded on June 20th with a one-sided American victory. Not a single US carrier was lost, while Japan's naval air arm was effectively annihilated. Shōkaku's sister ship Zuikaku survived that battle, recovering many of the few remaining aircraft only to be sacrificed as a decoy force at Leyte Gulf, later in October 1944. The loss of Shōkaku marked the collapse of Japan's veteran carrier arm. From Pearl Harbor to the Solomons, she had served as one of the fleet's most capable and battle-hardened carriers. Her sinking in June 1944, alongside Taiho and Hiryū, crippled Japan's ability to project naval air power, just as the US Navy reached its peak strength. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved catastrophic. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, while the Americans suffered almost no ship losses. For Japan, it was the end of the carrier war. Shōkaku's destruction also revealed the fatal flaws of Japanese carrier design. Despite her armor and experienced crew, she succumbed to the same vulnerability that doomed Taiho: aviation fuel vapor and poor compartmentalization. Earlier reforms had improved safety, demonstrated at Santa Cruz, where quick action prevented secondary explosions. But no carrier could survive multiple torpedoes while refueling aircraft. Shōkaku's death underscored how dangerous aviation fuel handling was in combat, prompting future navies to redesign fuel systems, reinforce damage control, and isolating hangars. Strategically, her loss stripped Japan of one of its last fully trained air groups and a symbol of its early war dominance. Even if Shōkaku had survived, the Imperial Navy's shortage of trained pilots and aircraft meant she could no longer change the outcome. By the summer of 1944, Japan's carriers were powerful in name only, empty decks without the veteran aviators that once made them feared. Shōkaku's service mirrors the rise and fall of Japan's naval empire. Bold in conception, brilliant in early execution, but ultimately overcome by superior resources and relentless attrition. From her triumph at Pearl Harbor to her fiery end in the Philippine Sea, Shōkaku embodied both the power and fragility of Japan's carrier fleet, a ship whose fate mirrored the course of the empire she served. In early May 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington was bracing for her fiercest battle yet. The Japanese Navy's powerful carrier force was closing in, and the Coral Sea would soon erupt in a furious duel of carrier aircraft. By the afternoon of May 8th, Lexington was heavily damaged, her decks ablaze and listing dangerously. With fires out of control and explosions tearing through her hull, the order finally came to abandon ship. Her crew, resolute to the end, gathered on her scarred decks as the sun set, leaving their proud carrier to slip beneath the waves. Explore Lexington's reclassification, her early missions across the Pacific, the fateful battle that sealed her fate, and her enduring legacy in carrier warfare. USS Lexington was first authorized in 1916 as a Lexington-class battlecruiser CC-1. She was laid down on January 8, 1921, at Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. The Washington Naval Treaty, established in 1922, halted the ship's original construction as a battlecruiser, so her hull was redesigned and she was reclassified as a carrier on July 1, 1922. Launched in October 1925 and commissioned on December 14, 1927, she became one of the US Navy's first true fleet carriers. Her hull retained the armored belt and much of the planned protection of a battlecruiser, roughly 5 to 7 inches of belt armor and up to 2 inches of deck armor, with armored bulkheads and gun turret of similar thickness. Measuring about 888 feet in length and 107 feet in beam, Lexington displaced roughly 47,000 tons at full load. Powering her were 16 Yarrow boilers feeding 4 turboelectric drives, together achieving 180,000 shaft horsepower, allowing her to achieve speeds of 33 knots. In her original configuration, Lexington carried a powerful gun inherited from her battlecruiser design. 4 twin-mount 8-inch 203mm guns stood on the starboard side of the flight deck, 2 forward and 2 aft. These battery guns were intended for surface action, though firing them risked damage to the flight deck. Her secondary armament consisted of a dozen 5-inch 127mm dual-purpose guns arrayed along the hull sides. By the start of 1942, just months before Coral Sea, Lexington had shed her heavy guns altogether. Her 4 8-inch twin turrets had been removed, later repurposed as coastal batteries on Oahu, and replaced by new anti-aircraft mountings. These included 17 5-inch guns in single mounts along the deck, 12 quad 1.1-inch 28mm gun mounts, and 22 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This transformation turned her once heavier armament into a formidable barrage against aircraft at the expense of surface gun firepower. As for her aircraft, she was designed to comfortably accommodate 78 aircraft. By 1942, her carrier complement at Coral Sea consisted of Grumman F-4F Wildcats, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Douglas TBD Devastators. In practice, she was a fast, powerfully armoured carrier with a large flight deck and potent, if aging, defences, a formidable centrepiece of the Pacific Fleet heading into 1942. When the Pacific War began at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Lexington was already at sea on a mission to reinforce outlying bases. She had been steaming back toward Hawaii, ferrying fighter squadrons westward for Midway, when news of the Japanese attack on Oahu arrived. Her dive bombers and fighters were launched on alert, but no enemy planes appeared. In the tense hours that followed, Lexington remained at sea, running patrols off Johnston Island and Honolulu. Fuel shortages forced her to return to Pearl by December 13th. Lexington's first significant engagement came in March 1942. Intelligence indicated Japanese ships gathered at Lae and Salamaua on New Guinea's northeast coast. On March 10th, at dawn, Lexington launched a powerful strike, attacking the Japanese troopships and transports in the harbour of Lae. They sank at least 3 transports and damaged others before Yorktown's aircraft joined 15 minutes later. Lexington's losses were light. 1 Dauntless was shot down by anti-air fire, but not before its pilot downed an enemy floatplane in return. Weather closed in, ending the raid without major damage to Lexington. By the afternoon, the carrier group retired. Lexington returned to Pearl Harbor by March 26th. Mid-April saw Lexington at sea again. On April 18th, American codebreakers had cracked Japan's intention for an invasion of Port Moresby, known commonly as Operation Mo, was set for early May. Lexington now carried roughly 21 Wildcat fighters, 37 Dauntless dive bombers, and 12 Devastator torpedo planes in its squadrons. Together with Yorktown, she steamed up along the Queensland coast toward the Coral Sea. The combined US force began meeting Japanese scout planes on May 2nd to 3rd as the 2 carrier groups converged. On May 7th, Lexington's air group finally struck its first carrier target. A search plane reported a Japanese light carrier, the Shōho, that was escorting the invasion convoy to Port Moresby. Lexington and Yorktown both launched strikes in the late morning. Lexington's dive bombers and torpedo planes hit Shōho repeatedly. In rapid succession, she took at least 7 hits. Bombs caused fuel fires on deck and hangar, and torpedoes wrecked her engineering. Lexington had helped destroy Japan's first carrier loss of the war. Meanwhile, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, forewarned by reconnaissance, were preparing their own devastating strikes. May 8, 1942, dawned over the Coral Sea. Lexington and Yorktown knew the Japanese carriers were near. The battle that morning would be the first between opposing carrier forces. Both fleets spotted each other at about 9 a.m. and launched strikes within minutes. Lexington's planes took off roughly at 9:07 a.m., 7 minutes after Yorktown's. The Americans headed northeast to where Japanese carriers were reported. In the morning air skirmishes, Yorktown's dive bombers hit Shōkaku's flight deck with bombs, leaving her unable to launch aircraft. Lexington's planes joined this attack, scoring 1 bomb hit on Shōkaku. By 11:05 a.m., the US carriers had returned from that strike, and the Japanese carriers launched their counterattack. They sent out 2 waves of aircraft, consisting of roughly 50 aircraft targeting Lexington. At 11:20 a.m., the torpedo planes found their mark. The first torpedo hit forward, jamming the aircraft elevator at the bow and cracking a fuel tank, causing minor leaks. The second struck amidships, rupturing Lexington's main port water lines and flooding 3 boiler rooms. These explosions shut down half her engines and pitched the carrier a heavy 6 to 7 degree list to port. Lexington slowed to 24 knots and began counter-flooding starboard tanks to correct her list. Barely minutes later, at about 11:30 a.m., more dive bombers struck the stricken carrier. Japanese aircraft from Shōkaku and Zuikaku dove in. One bomb slammed into the ready ammunition locker of a forward 5-inch gun mount, detonating it and killing that gun's crew. Another bomb found its way into the ship's funnel, killing dozens of gun crews nearby. Shrapnel from near misses punctured the hull, flooding 2 more compartments. The ship's list began to right itself as fuel and water were shifted. However, disaster struck from within. At 12:47 p.m., a massive internal explosion ripped through Lexington. The sparks in the funnel had ignited gasoline vapors pooled in damaged tanks and lines. A huge blowout shattered parts of the flight deck and sent men flying off their feet. Fires spread rapidly from the hangar up through the deck. But remarkably, flight deck operations continued. Over the next hour, Lexington's crews resumed launch and recovery. 6 returning Wildcats and Dauntlesses, still airborne that afternoon, made it to deck, and all surviving planes were landed or ditched by 2:14 p.m. At 2:42, another catastrophic explosion tore through Lexington. This blast, originating in the burning hangar, hurled the forward elevator many feet above the deck and severed the ship's remaining internal lines of communication and power. The forward half of the ship went dark. Firefighting crews on board fought to contain flames with dwindling resources, but the oil-fed inferno was spreading. By this time, both the forward and aft engine rooms had been evacuated. There was no way to pump out or contain the fires. Finally, at 5:07 p.m., the order was given to abandon ship. Life rafts and nets went over the side. Wounded men were transferred to destroyers on scene. A series of smaller blasts tore through the burning carrier between 6 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. as ammunition cooked off. Remarkably, Lexington lost only 216 men. The rest, over 2,700 sailors and airmen, were rescued by the escorting destroyers, including USS Phelps and others. Shortly after Lexington was abandoned, her fate was sealed. At 7:15 p.m., the destroyer USS Phelps was ordered to sink the hulk to prevent her from being captured or drifting hazardously. Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into the drifting carrier. At 7:52, 12 hours after the first attack in mid-morning, USS Lexington finally slid under the waves. By midnight on May 8th, the Coral Sea was littered with debris but quiet again. Both sides had paid a high price in ships and lives. For the US Navy, Lexington's loss was sobering. She had been America's first carrier sunk in war, with 216 officers and men dead and dozens of aircraft destroyed. The loss taught the Navy grim but invaluable lessons about damage control, fuel handling, and the ferocity of modern carrier combat. Strategically, Coral Sea was initially a mixed outcome. The US carriers lost Lexington, and Yorktown was damaged, but the Japanese paid too. The Imperial Navy's light carrier Shōho had been sunk by Lexington and Yorktown together on May 7th, and on May 8th, Yorktown's planes badly battered Shōkaku, putting her out of action for months. Zuikaku also lost most of her veteran aircrews in the battle, and was out of action while her aircrews were replenished and trained. Crucially, Japan's invasion fleet for Port Moresby was turned back. By nightfall on May 8th, the Imperial plan for Operation Mo was suspended, and Japanese forces were forced to withdraw instead of landing in New Guinea. In effect, Lexington's sacrifice, together with Yorktown's resistance, thwarted the Japanese advance toward Australia. In the battles to come, Coral Sea proved a strategic victory for the Allies, and helped influence the Battle of Midway as crucial carriers like Shōho, and more importantly, fleet carriers Shōkaku and Zuikaku were absent thanks to damage and heavy losses. For the US Navy, the namesake of Lexington would live on. Just weeks after the battle, the Navy decided to honor the sunken carrier. An Essex-class carrier under construction, originally named USS Cabot CV-16, was renamed Lexington on June 16, 1942. This new Lexington, an entirely different ship, carried forward the legacy of her namesake into the rest of World War II. The story of CV-2 ended in the Coral Sea's waters, but her name and lessons survived. October 24, 1944. The Sibuyan Sea in the central Philippines. The Imperial Japanese Navy's super battleship Musashi is about to face its ultimate test. This gargantuan warship, among the largest and most powerful ever built, powers forward as wave after wave of American carrier aircraft bear down upon it. Its crew braces at battle stations, determined to fight to the end. Musashi's final engagement during the Battle of Leyte Gulf became a brutal illustration of the changing face of naval warfare, a duel between a leviathan of steel and swarms of planes, ending with one of history's most dramatic sinkings. This is Musashi's origins, journey through World War II, and her final fate. In the late 1930s, Japan set out to build battleships so formidable that no rival could challenge them one-on-one. The result was the Yamato class, and Musashi, named after an ancient Japanese province, was the second of these super battleships. Laid down in 1938 and commissioned in August 1942, Musashi and her sister Yamato were the heaviest battleships ever constructed, each displacing around 73,000 tons at full load. At about 263 meters, or 862 feet in length, and 39 meters in beam, Musashi was a leviathan. Engineers even posted directional arrows in the corridors, because her interior was so vast that crewmen could get lost inside. Musashi carried 9 460mm 18.1-inch Type 94 main guns in 3 giant turrets, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. These could hurl 1.5-ton shells over 40 kilometers, or almost 25 miles. Her secondary battery included a dozen 155mm guns and a host of 127mm dual-purpose guns, complemented by scores of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, a number that would only grow as the war progressed. To withstand enemy fire, Musashi was protected by up to 410mm 16.1 inches of belt armor along her hull and armor up to 200 to 230mm on her decks. The gun turrets were encased in up to 650mm of armor, more than 2 feet of steel. Despite weighing as much as a small town, Musashi could make about 27 knots thanks to powerful steam turbines generating 150,000 shaft horsepower. She carried 6,300 tons of fuel oil, giving her a range of around 7,200 nautical miles at 16 knots, enough to steam across the Pacific and back. Japan built Musashi and her sisters to counter the numerically superior US Navy with sheer size and firepower. Each Yamato-class ship was meant to be individually superior to any American battleship, a floating fortress capable of taking tremendous punishment while delivering knockout blows with its 18-inch guns. In essence, Musashi was designed as the ultimate battleship, the centerpiece of Japan's decisive battle strategy. Commissioned in the summer of 1942, Musashi entered service as the war's tide was beginning to turn against Japan. She was soon fitted out as the flagship of the combined fleet, replacing her sister Yamato. In early 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and later Admiral Minechi Koga used Musashi as their command ship, a role befitting her stature. Based out of Truk Lagoon, Japan's formidable naval fortress in the Caroline Islands, Musashi sortied with the fleet on several occasions in 1943, attempting to intercept elusive US task forces, but these missions never made contact with the enemy. The great battleship often spent weeks waiting at Truk, as the Pacific War evolved into a carrier and submarine-driven conflict that gave few opportunities for battleship duels. In October 1943, for example, Musashi led a large task force in response to a rumored American carrier raid on Wake Island. The force, under Admiral Koga, included multiple battleships and carriers, a chance for Musashi to steam into action. But the Americans never materialized. The fleet returned to base without firing a shot. By the end of that year, Musashi had yet to engage enemy surface ships. Instead, she was often employed as a transport or prestige vessel. And as Japan's strategic situation worsened, this huge battleship even ferried troops and supplies to beleaguered island garrisons in early 1944, a far humbler task than the titanic gun battles for which she'd been built. Musashi's first battle damage came not from a surface action, but from under the waves. On March 29, 1944, while sailing off Palau, Musashi was ambushed by the American submarine USS Tone. The sub fired a spread of torpedoes, and one struck Musashi near her bow. A thunderous explosion rattled the ship. Though her thick armor held together, the hit tore a hole in the forward hull, causing significant flooding. Musashi limped away from Palau that night and returned to Japan for repairs. In dry dock, engineers fixed her bow and took the opportunity to bolster her anti-aircraft defenses dramatically. Dozens of additional 25mm AA guns were installed, recognizing the growing threat of Allied air power. By mid-1944, Musashi bristled with over 100 anti-aircraft barrels, ready to throw up a curtain of flak. This refit would prove timely. Her next trial would be fending off aerial attack. In June 1944, Musashi joined Admiral Takeo Kurita's Second Fleet as US forces invaded the Mariana Islands. What followed was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a massive carrier showdown, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by US pilots, that saw Japan's once formidable naval air arm nearly wiped out. Musashi and other surface ships sailed as part of the Japanese fleet, but the battle was decided entirely by aircraft. The American carriers' Hellcat fighters and shipboard anti-aircraft fire annihilated Japan's air groups. Musashi never fired her main guns in that engagement. After this defeat, the Japanese Navy was left with very few trained pilots and barely any functioning carriers. Their remaining battleships, Musashi included, would now have to fight under skies ruled by the enemy. As one Japanese observer noted, after the Philippine Sea, the fleet had no air cover. The battleships would have to rely on their own AA guns and hope for the best. This grim reality set the stage for Musashi's final mission. By October 1944, the United States had landed on Leyte in the Philippines, aiming to cut off Japan from its crucial resource areas. In response, the Japanese High Command launched Operation Shogo, a last-ditch plan to throw virtually the entire Japanese fleet at the Allied invasion force. The plan was complex and daring. A northern force of Japan's last carriers, with very few planes left, would sail as a decoy to lure Admiral Halsey's US Third Fleet away. Meanwhile, Musashi and the main striking force, dubbed the Center Force, would rush through the Philippine archipelago to fall upon the Leyte landing beaches from the west. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded this center force, which assembled in Brunei Bay, Borneo. On October 20th, 1944, Musashi departed Brunei as part of a massive armada. 5 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and numerous destroyers steamed toward the Philippines. The crew of Musashi knew this voyage was likely to bring the decisive battle they had trained for. Many were eager. Finally, the proud battleship would confront the enemy. But they also understood the dangers. The fleet had hardly any air support, and American carrier aircraft were expected to pounce. As Musashi headed into the Sibuyan Sea on October 24, 1944, everyone aboard could sense that a titanic confrontation was hours away. At dawn on October 24th, Kurita's center force entered the Sibuyan Sea, a broad stretch of water ringed by Philippine islands. The morning was partly cloudy, the sea calm, visibility was good. Just after 8 a.m., reports came in that 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship Otago, had been sunk by US submarines during the night, and Admiral Kurita had survived by swimming to another ship. It was a stark reminder that danger lurked from all directions. Undeterred, the remaining ships pressed on towards San Bernardino Strait. A few hours later, lookouts on Musashi spotted the telltale silhouettes of American reconnaissance planes high above, consolidated PB-4Y patrol bombers shadowing the fleet. The alarm was raised. Musashi went to general quarters. By 10:30 a.m., dozens of dots appeared in the sky to the east, inbound US carrier aircraft. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea had begun, and Musashi was at the epicenter of the storm. Massive water geysers from near misses and torpedo hits erupt around the battleship's hull as she endures a concentrated aerial onslaught. In this first wave, dive bombers plant several bombs on Musashi's deck, while torpedo planes score hits below the waterline. The battleship's gunners respond with furious anti-aircraft fire, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. Musashi reels from the impacts. One torpedo blows open her port side near the bow, and a 500-pound bomb penetrates her deck, killing crew and igniting fires. But the giant ship plows onward. Her crew swiftly counterfloods compartments to offset a growing list from the torpedo damage. Within minutes, damage control teams are fighting fires and patching leaks, even as the air attack continues overhead. The first attack is soon followed by a second and then a third, as the US Navy throws the kitchen sink at Musashi. In total, Admiral Halsey has dispatched around 259 carrier aircraft in at least 6 separate waves from the fleet carriers: Intrepid, Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Enterprise. Swarms of Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers take turns diving and torpedoing the Japanese formation. Recognizing Musashi as the biggest threat, many pilots single out the great battleship for attack. The air is filled with the scream of diving planes and the thunder of Musashi's own guns, her 127mm dual-purpose cannons, and dozens of 25mm guns blaze away in curtain fire. Still, not all the attackers can be stopped. Torpedoes streak in from multiple directions, cunningly aimed at alternating sides of the ship. Torpedo after torpedo slams into Musashi, ripping open her hull, both port and starboard. A hit to starboard floods another engine room. The loss of power causes her to slow and list further. Bombs rain down, smashing her upper works. One scores a direct hit on the bridge, killing or injuring many of the command staff. Through it all, Musashi's crew fights back doggedly, bringing down several aircraft. Some accounts say Japanese gunners shot down or damaged about 18 US planes that day. But the onslaught is unrelenting. An American pilot from Enterprise, Dan Smith, remembers attacking in early afternoon. When we emerged from the clouds, they opened up with flak like the hammers of hell. I saw all 8 of our torpedo planes score hits on the bow of Musashi, and 5 direct hits from our bombers. The last time I saw Musashi, she was stopped dead in the water, and her entire forecastle was awash. Indeed, by about 13:30, Musashi was gravely wounded, dipped low from massive flooding, and she gradually fell out of formation, drifting to a stop. Even as Musashi struggles, the US flyers return for one more deadly round. In the 5th and 6th waves, late in the afternoon, they concentrate on finishing off the drifting Leviathan. Grumman Avengers launch torpedoes aimed at Musashi's starboard side, seeking to punch holes in compartments not yet flooded. Dive bombers target the base of her smokestack and her stern. With only 3 of 4 propellers working and several boiler rooms drowned, Musashi can no longer dodge. She absorbs hit after hit. By the time the air attacks finally cease around 15:30, Musashi has sustained an almost unimaginable level of damage. Observers estimate she was hit by roughly 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes in total during the day's attacks. Many more near misses had stoved in her hull plating and further compromised her stability. It was punishment beyond anything any battleship had ever endured. Incredibly, Musashi remained afloat, a testament to her construction, but it was clear she was dying. On the shattered bridge, Captain Toshihira Inaguchi, who was also a rear admiral, assesses the situation. The ship is settling by the bow and listing severely to port despite desperate counter-flooding. Fires rage in the lower decks. Ammunition magazines are in danger of submerging or exploding. Rather than let his ship sink in deep water, Inaguchi gives orders to head for the nearest land in hope of beaching Musashi on the shallow coast of Burias Island to save her. The engineering crews try to comply, coaxing the remaining engines to turn over. Musashi begins moving at about 6 knots, but her wounds are too grave. She soon loses power completely and comes to a final halt. With water pouring uncontrollably into her forward sections, the bow of Musashi dips under the surface. Inaguchi, who had vowed to go down with his ship, radios a last message and dismisses himself to his cabin, refusing to evacuate. Around 7:15 that evening, Musashi's crew assembles on deck as the abandon ship order is finally passed. The surrounding escort destroyers, Kiyoshimo, Isokaze, and Hamikaze, move in as close as they dare to pick up survivors. Musashi's remaining officers ensure as many wounded as possible are offloaded onto rafts. Just after 7:30, as darkness falls, the mighty battleship's final moments come. She lists further to port, her bow plunging under. Sailors scramble off her decks and into the oil-streaked sea. With a thunderous roar of imploding compartments, the Musashi rolls over to port and sinks, bow first, into the Shibuyan Sea. Her stern rises briefly, screws still, and then slips under, leaving a mushroom cloud of steam, smoke, and debris on the surface. Out of Musashi's crew of 2,399 officers and men, some 1,376 survivors are rescued from the water by the escorting destroyers. Tragically, over 1,000 others perish with the ship, including Captain Inaguchi, who kept his promise to share his vessel's fate. Japan's largest battleship had finally succumbed to her wounds. The sinking of Musashi sent shockwaves through the Japanese fleet. Strategically, Musashi's loss was emblematic of the broader disaster that was the Battle of Leyte Gulf for Japan. In the 4-day struggle from October 23rd to 26th, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy gambled almost all its remaining capital ships and lost badly. Musashi was one of 3 battleships sunk during the battle. The others were Yamashiro and Fuso at Surigao Strait, and Japan's last functioning aircraft carriers were sacrificed as decoys. The once proud combined fleet was shattered as an effective fighting force. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy had little left in the tank. The few surviving big ships, like Yamato, were relegated to bases in Japan, waiting for a final opportunity to die gloriously. Musashi never reached the transports she was meant to annihilate, thanks to the aggressive US carrier strikes in the Shibuyan Sea. The battle demonstrated in the starkest terms the supremacy of air power over even the largest battleships. A ship that was virtually impervious to gunfire succumbed to bombs and torpedoes delivered by carrier aircraft miles away. This was a watershed moment. The age of the battleship as the dominant force at sea had passed. Leyte Gulf proved to be the last major fleet engagement of the war, and it confirmed that aircraft carriers now ruled the waves. The loss of Musashi reverberated through the remainder of World War II. The sight of her sinking, one of the largest warships ever built, vanquished by swarms of airplanes, was a sobering validation of a lesson learned at Pearl Harbor and Midway, and now conclusively proven at Leyte Gulf. For the officers and men who survived Musashi's final battle, it was an agonizing ordeal that stayed with them forever. For Japan, it was a national tragedy and a blow to morale, even kept secret from the public for a time. And for the world, Musashi's end marked the twilight of the battleship era. The story of Musashi's last stand in the Shibuyan Sea serves as a dramatic chapter in naval history, of a mighty ship's defeat, and of the inexorable rise of a new form of warfare that rendered such leviathans obsolete. December 18th, 1944, in the Philippine Sea. Waves climb 60 feet high, the wind screams past 100 knots, and Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet fights not Japan, but the Pacific itself. On USS New Jersey, crewmen on the bridge can't see the bow. Destroyers vanish in the mist. Aircraft snap their tie-downs and explode in carrier hangars. Within the hour, 3 destroyers will be gone, and nearly 800 sailors will vanish with them. This is the story of how the most powerful naval force of World War II sailed headfirst into a typhoon it never saw coming, and how the storm that followed changed the US Navy forever. In mid-December 1944, Admiral William Bull Halsey's US Third Fleet was operating in the Western Pacific as part of the Philippines campaign. Task Force 38, under Halsey's command, was a formidable armada: carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, conducting sustained air raids and covering General Douglas MacArthur's invasion. After weeks of fighting, many vessels were low on fuel and supplies, so Halsey ordered the fleet east to rendezvous with supply ships and replenish at sea, hoping to remain close to the action but out of range of land-based Japanese aircraft. At the time, wartime meteorology was primitive. Forecasts relied on limited reports from ships, islands, and occasional aircraft, with no satellites or computer models. Each carrier had an aerologist, and general forecasts came twice daily from Hawaii. Before the December 17th fueling, nothing alarming appeared in reports. Halsey's staff believed a disturbance was far to the east, but in reality, a compact tropical storm was already brewing dangerously close to the fleet. On December 17th, TF-38 attempted to refuel in worsening seas. Sailors struggled with heavy swells, hoses snapped, and destroyers like USS Maddox nearly collided with oilers. By noon, Halsey aborted the attempt and set a new rendezvous for the following morning, hoping for calmer waters. Unbeknownst to Halsey, his chosen haven lay directly in the path of the intensifying storm. The weather reports he relied on were dangerously inaccurate. In fact, Typhoon Cobra, as it would later be designated, was lurking only about 120 miles to the east of the fleet's current position. Captain Jasper Acuff, commanding the replenishment group, TG 30.8, became concerned that severe weather was moving toward the new refueling point, and warned that the next day's rendezvous might be overrun by the storm. Meanwhile, Fleet Weather Central in Hawaii plotted the disturbance as heading due north, missing the true westward track that would bring it right over Halsey's task force. Trusting the information at hand, but determined not to stray too far from supporting MacArthur's ongoing landings, Halsey unwittingly kept the Third Fleet on a collision course with the typhoon. Over the late hours of December 17th, the seas continued to build. Halsey adjusted plans repeatedly as reports trickled in. Late that afternoon, upon learning of worsening weather near the second rendezvous, he ordered a new fallback rendezvous point, a third location, and steered the fleet due west, managing to outrun the storm for a brief time. Yet the reprieve was temporary. By nightfall, communications were patchy and confusion spread as the deteriorating weather forced ships to disperse over a wide area. With heavy swells battering his ships, Halsey cancelled the third rendezvous and designated a fourth one even further northwest. In an effort to use the wind direction to advantage, he ordered a course change from west to due south, planning to later swing northwest toward the new refueling point in the early morning hours. These zigzag maneuvers inadvertently kept the fleet crisscrossing in front of the oncoming typhoon. The men on board began to sense that this was no ordinary storm. Many ships were now essentially running blind in a maelstrom of mounting waves and gale-force winds. In the pre-dawn hours of December 18th, 1944, conditions went from bad to worse. Vessels across Task Force 38 recorded steadily falling barometric pressure and wind speeds rising past 40 knots. Driving rain squalls and darkness obscured visibility. Crewmen on carrier flight decks had to crawl on hands and knees to avoid being blown overboard by the howling wind. The barometer on some ships was dropping very rapidly, a classic telltale of an approaching cyclone's eye wall. Still, without a clear picture of the storm's center, the fleet pushed on. As the typhoon's full fury closed in, one carrier's radar actually picked up an unusual blip, the curvature of the storm's eye itself, indicating just how close they were to the heart of the tempest. By late morning, Typhoon Cobra was savaging the Third Fleet. Winds of 73 knots, 84 miles per hour, and more were recorded. In fact, some gusts likely exceeded 100 knots, and waves towered as high as 60 to 70 feet, blending sea and sky into a chaos of white spray. Halsey's flagship, the battleship USS New Jersey, struggled to stay on course amid 30 to 40-foot seas. By 1100 hours on the 18th, many vessels had lost formation entirely. Captain Jasper Acuff of the replenishment group later reported that in some ships, the separation of ocean and clouds vanished entirely in the onslaught, a terrifying whiteout of seawater and driving rain. Sailors were ordered to stay off exposed decks as waves crashed over warships' bows and even flight decks. In these conditions, Halsey finally broadcast a fleet-wide typhoon warning at 13:45, the first official acknowledgement of the crisis. But by that time, the storm had already exacted a deadly toll. As Typhoon Cobra raged into the midday of December 18th, it became the worst nightmare of every sailor. The most vulnerable were the destroyers, relatively small warships now caught in monstrous seas with partially empty fuel tanks. Standard practice in heavy weather was to ballast down to add stability, but many destroyer captains had delayed doing so, hoping to refuel at the rendezvous points. Now it was too late. The destroyer USS Spence was among those low on fuel, down to only about 15% of capacity. Her crew belatedly began pumping seawater into her nearly empty fuel tanks, but Spence was already being overwhelmed. Enormous waves pounded her hull, and at around 11:10 a.m., she was blasted by a violent gust. Water poured down her ventilation uptakes and shorted out her electrical systems, knocking out the engines. Without power, Spence lost all headway and lay beam on to the towering waves. Moments later, the ship rolled dangerously to port and never righted herself. The Fletcher-class destroyer capsized and sank, vanishing into the foam. Out of a crew of over 300, only 23 men survived the sinking of Spence. Near the same time, the older destroyer USS Hull was fighting for her life. Hull was a Farragut-class destroyer commissioned in the 1930s and had been refitted with additional armament and radar that made her top-heavy. Despite having about 70% fuel remaining, Hull's high center of gravity left her vulnerable. She struggled in winds over 100 knots, rolling 50 degrees one way, then 70 degrees the other. Captain James Marks and his crew managed to survive those rolls, but around midday, an even more ferocious gust, estimated at 110 knots, struck Hull. The destroyer heeled over past 70 degrees. Seawater rushed into her smokestack and bridge. Overwhelmed, USS Hull capsized in the raging seas. Crew on other ships watched in horror as the hull disappeared. Most of her men went down with the ship. Out of over 200 aboard, only 62 survived to be rescued. USS Monaghan met a similar fate. Monaghan had 76% fuel aboard, more than Spence or Hull, but she too was top-heavy and had been forced to lighten ballast in order to accept fuel during the aborted refueling. As the typhoon's mountainous waves battered her, Monaghan attempted to ballast further, but some valves stuck, delaying the process. Around 11:30 a.m., Monaghan was hammered by the storm. The ship began taking on severe rolls and then lost both electrical power and steering control. Helpless against the onslaught, the Monaghan foundered and sank, leaving debris and men tossed in the tempest. Out of a crew of roughly 256, only 6 survivors were eventually found alive. Even the larger warships suffered terribly. Escort carriers and fleet carriers, with their broad decks, were slammed by the wind. Planes broke free from their lashings on pitching flight decks and became missiles inside the hangars. A Hellcat fighter or Avenger torpedo bomber weighing several tons, would snap loose and careen across a hangar bay, smashing into other aircraft or bulkheads. A number of carriers faced dangerous onboard fires as fueled aircraft exploded on impact. The light carrier USS Monterey nearly met a catastrophic end, not from sinking, but from flames. Around 9:11 that morning, Monterey, a 11,000-ton carrier, was rocked by a chain reaction below decks. Several planes broke free and collided, igniting gasoline fires in the hangar. As the hangar inferno spread, smoke poured into the engine rooms, choking off the boilers and causing the ship to lose propulsion. A Monterey junior officer, Lieutenant Gerald R. Ford, the future US president, was serving as officer of the deck. Ford nearly got swept overboard himself as the carrier heeled over 20 degrees and more while he made his way to report on the fire. Directed by Captain Stuart Ingersoll, Lieutenant Ford navigated the smoke-filled passageways to assess the blaze and then reported back up to the bridge on its status. Monterey's crew fought back the conflagration with everything they had. Firefighting teams, some led by Ford and other officers, battled the blaze for 40 minutes in suffocating heat. By 9:45, they managed to contain the fire before it could consume the ship. Monterey was saved, but she was severely damaged and left dead in the water until her engineers could clear the smoke from the boilers. The carrier had lost 18 aircraft to fire and overboard losses, with another 16 wrecked, and suffered multiple casualties. 3 of Monterey's crew were killed, and nearly 40 injured in that blaze. Elsewhere, the carrier USS Cowpens CVL-25 was also hit by a loose, flaming aircraft, but her crew doused the flames quickly. USS Langley CVL-27 rolled up to 70 degrees in the waves, nearly capsizing, while USS San Jacinto CVL-30 had 7 planes break loose in her hangar, wreaking havoc before they could be secured. Across the task force, 146 aircraft were wrecked or blown overboard by the time the typhoon relented. By the afternoon of December 18th, Typhoon Cobra had scattered Halsey's powerful fleet over a 50 to 60-mile area. Ships that could still navigate were struggling to reconnect with each other. Slowly, the furious winds and seas began to subside. For many crewmen, the end of the storm brought a grim realization. Multiple ships had vanished. Destroyers signaled queries that went unanswered in the spray. Life jackets, rafts, and debris bobbed in the water where proud warships had been. It was only when the weather cleared enough for survivors to be spotted in the ocean that the scale of the disaster became evident. When Typhoon Cobra finally passed, Admiral Halsey directed all available ships to search for men overboard and survivors from the lost destroyers. What followed were desperate rescue efforts in the still rough seas. Many sailors had been adrift for hours, clinging to floater nets, life rafts, or simply bobbing in life vests among the wreckage. One unlikely hero of the rescue operation was the destroyer escort USS Tabara DE-418, a small ship that had herself been badly damaged. She lost her foremast and radio antennas to the storm. Tabara, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Henry Lee Plage, defied the odds and defied orders in the name of saving lives. On the night of the 18th, while the typhoon still raged, Tabara had accidentally come upon a single sailor clinging to wreckage, a survivor of Hull. Realizing men were in the water, Plage ignored the general order for all ships to proceed to port and began a systematic search pattern in the debris-strewn ocean. For the next 51 hours, Tabara's crew painstakingly combed through the area, even as their ship rolled sickeningly. Thanks to their determination, Tabara rescued 55 survivors, men from Hull, Spence, and Monaghan, who otherwise might have never been found. Other ships picked up additional survivors once the weather cleared, and in total, 93 sailors were rescued of the over 800 who had been cast into the sea from the 3 sunken destroyers. For his ship's extraordinary, life-saving efforts, LCDR Plage was later awarded the Legion of Merit by Halsey, and Tabara's crew received the Navy Unit Commendation, the first ever awarded, honoring their bravery and initiative. On December 19th, Halsey brought the battered Third Fleet into the anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, a rear base, as soon as it was safe to do so. It was not until roughly 2 a.m. on December 19th that Halsey himself learned definitively what signals and reports had hinted. 3 destroyers were lost with almost all hands. The news was devastating. In the storm's aftermath, the fleet had just suffered one of the US Navy's worst disasters, delivered by Mother Nature herself. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, stated that the Typhoon's impact represented a more crippling blow to the Third Fleet than it might be expected to suffer in anything less than a major action. The toll was staggering. 790 American sailors were dead or missing as a result of the typhoon. 3 destroyers had been sunk outright, while 27 other ships, including battleships, cruisers, and carriers, had sustained storm damage. 11 ships were damaged so badly they had to be sent back to port for major repairs. Dozens of naval aircraft were lost or destroyed. It was, by any measure, the US Navy's worst loss to weather in its history. The calamity demanded a formal accounting. Even though the United States was in the middle of a war, the Navy took the unprecedented step of convening a court of inquiry to investigate the disaster while memories were fresh. In early January 1945, aboard the repair ship USS Cascade at Ulithi, a panel of admirals, with Admiral Nimitz himself in attendance, questioned Halsey and his staff on their decisions leading up to the typhoon. The court's findings, delivered in February 1945, did not recommend harsh discipline, but they did not let Halsey off the hook either. The board concluded that Admiral Halsey had committed an error of judgment in sailing the Third Fleet into the heart of the typhoon. At the same time, they tempered this critique by noting the pressures of wartime operations. Halsey's choices, they said, were errors in judgment committed under the stress of war operations and stemming from a commendable desire to meet military requirements. In other words, he had pushed to refuel and keep stationed to support the troops, but misjudged the risk, a costly mistake, but one made in the zeal of combat. Thus, the Navy stopped short of formally censuring or punishing Halsey. He was, however, quietly removed from operational command for a period. In January 1945, Halsey transferred leadership of the fleet to Admiral Raymond Spruance, though Halsey would later resume command in the final stages of the war. The inquiry also identified others' mistakes. Notably, it faulted the commanding officers of Spence, Hull, and Monaghan for waiting too long to take preventive action, such as ballasting down and slowing to ride out the storm. This delay, the court suggested, contributed to the ship's losses when the full brunt of the typhoon struck. It was a hard pill, acknowledging that some of the lost crew's own decisions may have sealed their fates, but the intent was to learn and prevent such tragedies going forward. Typhoon Cobra's legacy spurred the Navy to improve training, procedures, and weather forecasting. The ordeal prompted new rules for ship stability in storms, revised destroyer design to reduce top heaviness, and encouraged dispersing fleets to evade major storms rather than risk formation in extreme weather. Most significantly, Typhoon Cobra exposed deficiencies in meteorological intelligence. The fact that a typhoon had caught the Third Fleet by surprise was unacceptable to Navy leadership. In response, the Navy dramatically overhauled its weather tracking network in the Pacific. They established more frequent weather reconnaissance flights and deployed weather ships to remote ocean areas to report conditions in real time. By mid-1945, a new Fleet Weather Central was operating out of Guam to provide closer and timelier support to fleets at sea. These improvements were put to the test almost immediately. In June 1945, 6 months after Cobra, another powerful typhoon, Typhoon Connie, struck the US fleet off Okinawa. This time, forewarned by improved tracking, commanders took evasive action, although that storm still inflicted damage on several ships. Though Typhoon Cobra was a catastrophe, it did not alter the course of the Pacific War. The US Navy recovered, repaired its ships, and sailed back into action. But for the men who lived through it, and for the Navy, the storm was a sobering reminder that the sea can be as lethal as any enemy. It remains the worst natural disaster in US Navy history. The Third Fleet's ordeal in Typhoon Cobra ultimately resulted in a smarter, more weather-wise Navy. The tragedy forged improvements that have since saved countless lives, ensuring that such a surprise blow to a fleet should never happen again. Typhoon Cobra was a lesson paid for in blood, but it taught the Navy that even in the absence of enemy action, vigilance and respect for nature's power are absolutely paramount. In June 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy's dreadnought battleship Mutsu was destroyed by a sudden magazine explosion while anchored in Hiroshima Bay. At 12:13 on the 8th of June 1943, one of Mutsu's own gun magazines detonated, cutting her hull in two and causing the forward section to capsize almost immediately. The Imperial Navy officially attributed the explosion to an act of sabotage by a disgruntled seaman and suppressed news of the disaster to prevent a loss of morale. Explore Mutsu's development and service, the circumstances of her sinking, the subsequent investigation, and the legacy of this wartime mystery. Mutsu was the second and final ship of Japan's Nagato class of dreadnought battleships. She was laid down in June 1918 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal and launched on the 31st of May 1920. Commissioned on the 24th of October 1921, Mutsu had a displacement of 32,000 tons at full load. She measured 707 feet in overall length and a beam of 95 feet. Her designed crew complement was about 1,330 officers and men, rising to roughly 1,475 by 1942. In the late 1920s and 1930s, Mutsu underwent major reconstruction that lengthened and strengthened her hull. A 1927 refit extended her bow by 5 feet, and a more extensive rebuild from 1934 to 1936 added 22 feet to her stern with torpedo bulges for extra protection and buoyancy. After these upgrades, her full load displacement increased to about 39,000 tons. The reconstruction also modernized her superstructure into the characteristic Japanese pagoda mast and replaced her boilers. Originally driven by 4 geared steam turbines rated at 80,000 shaft horsepower. After the 1930s refit with newer boilers, she could sustain nearly 25 knots at about 82,000 shaft horsepower in sea trials. Mutsu carried a powerful main armament of 8 16.1-inch guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These guns fired Special Type 3 Sanshikidan anti-aircraft shrapnel shells, as well as armor-piercing rounds. Her secondary armament consisted of 18 5.5-inch guns in casemate mounts along the hull sides and superstructure. During the 1930s refits, Mutsu's anti-aircraft battery was considerably increased with multiple twin 127mm guns, twin 40mm pom-pom mounts, and numerous 25mm cannons. But the core layout of main and secondary batteries remained the same. Mutsu was well armoured for her era. A thick cemented steel belt up to 12 inches covered the main hull, tapering down toward the lower edge. In short, Mutsu embodied the cutting-edge dreadnought design of the early 20th century, combining heavy firepower with strong armour and a high speed considering her specifications. Mutsu entered service during a turbulent naval arms era. In late 1921, while she was fitting out, the Washington Naval Conference proposed scrapping many capital ships. Japan negotiated to keep Mutsu by retiring the obsolete battleship Setsu instead. Following her commissioning, Mutsu served as a flagship in the 1st Battleship Division. In peacetime, she took part in fleet maneuvers and reviews. Notably, in September 1923, Mutsu was one of the ships that loaded and delivered supplies for survivors of the Great Kanto earthquake. She also conducted gunnery practice, including sinking the hulk of the old battleship Satsuma in 1924 as per treaty limits. In the mid-1930s, after reconstruction, she resumed frontline duty and even supported Japan's actions in China. In August 1937, Mutsu transported about 2,000 troops to Shanghai and launched seaplanes against targets during the early phase of the Second Sino-Japanese War. By late 1939, she had been placed in reserve for a time, but was refitted in early 1941 in preparation for the wider Pacific conflict. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, Mutsu saw limited action. From the 8th to the 14th of December 1941, she sortied south with the battleship force as distant support for the Pearl Harbor strike, but did not engage any enemy ships. In mid-January 1942, Mutsu towed the obsolete armored cruiser Nishin to be used as a target by the new battleship Yamato. The Nishin was promptly sunk in that exercise. In June 1942, she was part of the main battle line at the Battle of Midway under Admiral Gunji Kogure. The ship did not see combat at Midway, though some of the carrier aircraft survivors from the Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, were transferred aboard Mutsu on the 6th of June and taken back to Japan, and she returned safely to Hashirajima by the 14th of June. Later in 1942, Mutsu deployed briefly to the Central Pacific. In late August 1942, she was assigned to a covering force based at Truk for the Guadalcanal campaign. During the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 27th of August, Mutsu's crew fired 4 main gun rounds at a US reconnaissance plane, the only time her 41cm guns were used in combat during the war. She then returned to Truk on the 2nd of September. In October 1942, Mutsu offloaded excess fuel oil to an oiler to support other ships around Guadalcanal. By early January 1943, she was back in Japan. In the late morning of the 8th of June 1943, Mutsu lay at anchor in the Hashirajima Fleet anchorage in Hiroshima Bay, alongside the battleship Fuso and other warships. A total of 113 naval flight cadets from the Tsuchiura Naval Air Group and 40 instructors were on board for familiarization training. At 12:13, the magazine of Mutsu's No. 3 gun turret suddenly exploded. The blast was devastating. It destroyed the surrounding superstructure and sliced the 750-foot ship in two. Seawater rushed into the open machinery spaces, causing the forward 150-meter section to capsize rapidly to starboard and sink almost immediately. The remaining 45-meter stern section stayed afloat for several hours. It eventually upended and sank at about 2 o'clock on the 9th of June, coming to rest only a few hundred feet south of the main wreck site. Nearby Japanese ships launched rescue efforts at once. Destroyers Tamanami and Wakatsuki, and the cruisers Tatsuta and Mogami, along with small boats from Fuso, picked up survivors. Notably, Captain Miyoshi's wife was not notified of his death until January 1944, reflecting the secrecy surrounding the incident. By early evening on the 9th of June, the wreck of Mutsu had settled on the harbour bottom. The Japanese Navy decided not to attempt immediate salvage. The shock and loss prompted the highest levels of command to keep the disaster secret. The destruction of a battleship in home waters was officially suppressed to avoid undermining public morale. Mass cremations of recovered bodies began at once, and the survivors were quietly dispersed to other units in the Pacific. In Japanese records, the ship's sinking was not announced, and her loss would not be publicly acknowledged until after the war. On the 11th of June 1943, 3 days after the explosion, the Navy convened a special commission, headed by Admiral Koichi Shiozawa, to investigate the cause of the disaster. The inquiry considered several possibilities. First, enemy sabotage was ruled out. Heavy security at the anchorage and the complete lack of any enemy claim made that hypothesis unlikely. A submarine or midget submarine attack was similarly discounted after extensive patrols failed to locate any attacker, and no Allied force claimed sinking a Japanese ship at Hashirajima on that date. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a reddish-brown fireball above the ship at the time of the explosion, which was characteristic of a magazine detonation rather than an external torpedo hit. The investigators focused on internal causes. One scenario was an intentional act by a crew member. The commission noted that a petty officer in the number 3 turret had recently been accused of theft and was believed to be in despair. While no culprit was identified or charged, the commission's report would ultimately conclude that the blast was, most likely, set off by this disgruntled sailor. Another hypothesis was accidental. Mutsu carried special Type 3 Sanshikidan anti-aircraft incendiary shells in her magazines. These shells contained many small tubes of incendiary material, and a past fire at the Sagami arsenal had been blamed on them. The Navy tested salvaged shells from Mutsu's number 3 turret under controlled conditions. Those experiments, using a model turret and recovered charges, showed that under normal conditions, the shells did not detonate spontaneously. No evidence of any internal fire or malfunction was found by the divers who inspected the wreck after the fact. The investigative board issued its interim findings on the 25th of June 1943. It announced that a disgruntled seaman in the turret had most likely caused the explosion. In other words, the official position blamed sabotage from within the crew, rather than enemy action or a technical fault. The commission did not release detailed proof, and no individual was publicly named. With this conclusion, the inquiry was closed, and the incident was treated as an internal tragedy. Decades later, some analysts would continue to question aspects of the case, but the wartime report remains the primary source. In the months after Mutsu sank, the Imperial Navy took deliberate steps to cover up the event. The ship was removed from the Navy list on the 1st of September 1943. Survivors of Mutsu were quietly reassigned to distant posts and fleets to minimize talk of the disaster. By July 1944, the sunken battleship was yielding valuable resources. Divers recovered about 580 metric tons of fuel oil from the wreck to supplement Japan's depleted supply. After World War II, the remains of Mutsu became an object of salvage and remembrance. In 1953, divers raised the large 1.2-meter chrysanthemum imperial emblem from the bow, though it was later lost or scrapped. One of Mutsu's casemate guns was salvaged in 1963 and donated to the Yasukuni Shrine for display. Beginning in 1970, the Fakada Salvage Company undertook large-scale recovery operations. By 1978, they had scrapped roughly 75% of the wreck for its low background steel, sought after for nuclear research. Salvages raised both aft triple gun turrets in 1970 to 71, along with the propellers, rudders, and other equipment. In total, 849 bodies of crewmen lost in the explosion were recovered during the salvage effort. Eventually, the remaining hull fragments were broken up or buried. Only a short 35-meter section of Mutsu's structure, from amidships forward, still lies on the seabed, with its highest point about 12 meters below the surface. In all, the story of Mutsu stands as a sober chapter of naval history. A powerful battleship, lost not in battle, but to a sudden, internally born catastrophe whose full truth may never be known. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese carrier force was burning. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu lay crippled at Midway. Only one ship remained, Hiryū. With Admiral Yamaguchi refusing to retreat, Hiryū launched desperate strikes that crippled USS Yorktown. By evening, American dive bombers found her too. Within hours, Hiryū was a flaming ruin, the last of Japan's carriers to fall at Midway. This is the story of Hiryū, her design, her brief but violent service, and her desperate final battle at Midway. Hiryū was conceived in the 1930s as a purpose-built fleet carrier, unlike several of her Japanese sisters that began life as converted battleships or battlecruisers. In fact, Hiryū and her near sister, Soryu, were the only carriers of the elite Kido Butai, 1st Air Fleet, designed from the keel up purely for aviation, rather than rebuilt from existing hulls. Originally intended to be Soryu's identical sister, Hiryū's design was enlarged and improved after 2 naval engineering lessons: the Tomozuru capsizing and the 4th Fleet incident typhoon damage of 1934–35 exposed stability flaws in many of Japan's warships. As a result, Hiryū was built with a broader beam, strengthened hull, and increased protection compared to Soryu. These changes made Hiryū sufficiently distinct that she is often considered a class of her own. At 746 feet in length, with a full load displacement around 17,600 tons, Hiryū could make an impressive 34 knots. She was armed with 6 twin 5-inch dual-purpose guns and a suite of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, though like most early war carriers, her AA defences left much to be desired. Her true strength lay in her air group, roughly 70 aircraft, about 57 operational with spares, consisting of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Notably, Hiryū was one of only 2 carriers ever built with its command island on the port side, the other being Akagi. Her bridge sat to the left and further aft, slightly intruding over the flight deck, an unconventional layout meant to facilitate simultaneous flight operations with her division mate Soryu. This unique portside island earned Hiryū a distinctive profile and symbolized her innovative design. In Japanese, Hiryū means flying dragon, an auspicious name that befitted the sleek and purpose-crafted carrier that joined the fleet in 1939. Commissioned in July 1939, Hiryū quickly became part of Japan's expanding carrier force. She was assigned to the 2nd Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, a rising star among Japan's naval aviators. Even before the Pacific War formally began, Hiryū's air group saw action in East Asia. In mid-1940, her squadrons provided air support for the Japanese invasion of French Indochina, projecting power onto the Asian mainland. By late 1941, Hiryū and her sister carriers formed the striking arm of Kido Butai, poised for the opening blow of World War II in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Hiryū's aircraft joined the attack on Pearl Harbor, launching waves of bombers and fighters against the US Pacific Fleet. Her pilots strafed airfields and bombed warships. Some sources credit Hiryū's dive bombers with contributing to the destruction of USS Arizona on Battleship Row. A week later, Hiryū also took part in the assault on Wake Island, helping subdue that stubborn American outpost after the first Japanese attack had been repelled. In the early months of 1942, Hiryū ranged across the Pacific as Japan's naval offensive rolled on. In January-February, she and her consorts supported the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, striking targets from the Philippines down through Indonesia. On February 19, 1942, Hiryū's air wing participated in a massive carrier raid on Darwin, Australia, bombing the harbour and airfield in one of the first attacks on the Australian mainland. In April 1942, she joined Admiral Nagumo's carriers in the bold Indian Ocean raid. Hiryū's dive bombers and torpedo planes helped hunt down and sink British ships, including 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, and terrorized Allied bases from Ceylon to the Bay of Bengal. This thrust into the Indian Ocean showcased the striking power of Japan's carriers at their peak. By late April, however, Hiryū returned to Japan for a short refit. The frenetic pace of operations had taxed ship and crew, and a brief maintenance period was needed to prepare for the next big mission. Even as Hiryū refitted, another drama was unfolding in the South Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea, early May 1942, marked the first carrier duel of the war. Hiryū did not participate in Coral Sea. That battle was fought by her sister carriers, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, which suffered damage and aircrew losses. Those losses meant that Japan's 2 newest fleet carriers would miss the upcoming Midway operation. Thus, when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto set in motion his plan to ambush the US Navy at Midway Atoll, Hiryū was one of only 4 fleet carriers available for the strike force. Together with Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, she sailed as part of Nagumo's first air fleet in late May 1942, heading east into history. The Battle of Midway erupted before dawn as Nagumo's carriers launched a coordinated airstrike against Midway Island. Aboard Hiryū, Captain Tomeo Kaku oversaw the pre-dawn launch of bombers and fighters toward the American outpost. These joined the armada of planes that pounded Midway's airfields shortly after 6:30 a.m. The island's installations were hit hard, but not neutralized. Many American defenders survived to strike back, as Nagumo's armada recovered planes around 7 a.m. Midway-based aircraft counterattacked the Japanese carriers. Hiryū and the others came under fierce assault. Her gunners and combat air patrol Zeros managed to shoot down or drive off most of these attackers, but it was a harbinger of worse to come. Amidst this melee, Hiryū's air group leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, returned from the Midway strike with his Kate bomber riddled and low on fuel, reporting that a second attack on the island was needed. This report helped shape Vice Admiral Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm his reserve planes for a land strike, just as American carrier aircraft were closing in. By 10:20 a.m., Midway's turning point arrived. While Hiryū's crew scrambled to arm torpedoes and refuel planes for a potential second Midway strike, dive bombers from USS Enterprise and Yorktown pierced the skies above the Japanese fleet. In a span of minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were struck by well-placed 1,000-pound bombs that turned them into flaming wrecks. Hiryū was missed entirely by this first American onslaught. As smoke mushroomed from the other 3 flat tops, Hiryū suddenly found herself the sole surviving carrier. On her bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi grasped the gravity of the moment. Rather than flee, he immediately chose to counterattack with everything Hiryū had left. Within an hour, the Flying Dragon had armed and spotted a strike force on deck. She was determined to bite back. Around 11:30 a.m., Hiryū launched the first of 2 counterstrikes aimed at the US carriers, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Racing through the clear skies, this formation sighted USS Yorktown shortly after noon. Yorktown and her escorts braced as the Japanese dive bombers pushed over into steep dives. Despite defensive fire and fighter opposition, several bombs tore into Yorktown just before 12:30 p.m., blowing gaping holes in her flight deck and igniting fires. The proud American carrier was brought to a halt, shrouded in smoke. Believing they had sunk one enemy carrier, Hiryū's pilots returned triumphant. In reality, Yorktown's crew managed to quench the fires within an hour, and miraculously, the battered carrier got underway again. Unaware of Yorktown's survival, Admiral Yamaguchi prepared Hiryū's second wave to target the remaining US carriers. At 1:30 p.m., Hiryū sent off 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, one borrowed from Akagi's detachment to make up numbers, escorted by 6 Zeros, including 2 from Kaga. Yamaguchi astutely ordered this strike to seek a different carrier than the one hit earlier, to maximize damage. As this second wave approached the American task force around 2:30 p.m., they found what looked like an untouched carrier plodding below. In fact, the resilient Yorktown. The Japanese, thinking this must be a fresh target, either Enterprise or Hornet, pressed the attack. Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns and a handful of defending Wildcats managed to shoot down several incoming Kates, but some got through. Amidst fierce low-level maneuvering, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's flank in quick succession. Explosions ripped open her port side, knocking out boilers and power. Within minutes, the once again crippled Yorktown began listing heavily as flooding spread. Captain Buckmaster ordered Yorktown abandoned at 3 p.m., her crew reluctantly leaping into the sea. Hiryū's second strike had achieved its goal. Yorktown was out of action. Of Hiryū's second wave attackers, however, only a few made it back. Losses were severe, and the carrier's air group was now largely spent. By mid-afternoon, Admiral Yamaguchi's aggressive counterpunch had badly hurt the US fleet, but he did not know that 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, were still operational. Yamaguchi signaled Nagumo, proposing to launch yet a third strike at dusk with any aircraft Hiryū had left, perhaps a piecemeal force of the few surviving bombers and fighters. It was a desperate thought. Hiryu by then only had 4 operational dive bombers and 5 torpedo planes remaining, plus some Zeros on deck. Nagumo, now aboard a cruiser after Akagi's demise, forbade the idea and ordered the fleet to withdraw westward. But by that point, the Americans had already located Hiryu and were preparing to finish the job. At 3:25, USS Enterprise had launched 26 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, including some planes from the damaged Yorktown, and USS Hornet sent another 16 dive bombers at 4 o'clock. These aircraft fanned out, searching for the remaining Japanese flat top. At 4:45, lookouts aboard Hiryu spotted enemy planes just as those same American Dauntlesses caught sight of Hiryu. The carrier and her escorts zigzagged desperately. Hiryu's few combat air patrol fighters, joined by surviving pilots from the other sunk carriers, clawed into the incoming squadrons. They managed to splash several Dauntlesses, but they could not stop the attack. Around 4:56, as Hiryu turned hard and her gunners blazed away, dive bombers from Enterprise and the orphaned Yorktown group commenced their dives. 4 1,000-pound bombs smashed into Hiryu in rapid succession. 3 bombs ripped through the forward flight deck and hangar, while 1 hit near the midship elevator. The result was cataclysmic. Fires and explosions roared through the hangars, consuming fueled aircraft and ammunition. The forward half of Hiryu's flight deck collapsed into the hangar bay, and part of the forward elevator was blown up into the air. Within minutes, the Flying Dragon was engulfed in flame from bow to stern. Recognizing the carrier was mortally stricken, the remaining US dive bombers diverted to attack nearby Japanese escort ships. Hiryu herself was clearly finished. By 5:10, when the last American planes withdrew, Hiryu was a floating inferno, her decks and hangars in an uncontrolled blaze. On Hiryu's smoke-shrouded bridge, Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku assessed the devastation. Damage control teams fought to contain the fires, but with each passing hour, the blazes only grew. The ship's propulsion and boilers remained intact for a time, allowing Hiryu to limp along at reduced speed, but the inferno on deck could not be tamed. By 9:23 p.m., Hiryu's engines finally died as fire damaged the engine compartments, and she drifted to a standstill in the darkness. Around 11:58, a massive secondary explosion, likely the detonating torpedoes or bombs in her magazines, shook the ship, sealing her fate. Yamaguchi ordered preparations to abandon ship. But first, the admiral chose to perform a final act of warrior honor. Gathering the roughly 800 survivors who remained aboard, including wounded men carried up by their crewmates, on the flight deck near the island, Yamaguchi led them in a solemn banzai salute to the emperor and a singing of the Japanese national anthem. In the eerie glow of the fires, the men's voices rose in unison, a haunting farewell to their ship and nation. With that, at about 3:15 on June 5th, the order was given to abandon Hiryu. Hundreds of crew clambered down ropes or slid directly into the sea, to be picked up by the destroyers Kazugumo and Makigumo waiting nearby. Admiral Yamaguchi, however, refused to leave his flagship. The 49-year-old Yamaguchi, widely regarded as one of Japan's finest carrier commanders, believed in the Bushido code of self-sacrifice and chose to go down with Hiryu as atonement for the fleet's defeat. Captain Kaku likewise elected to stay by his ship. The two men then shook hands with remaining staff and wished their comrades well. Yamaguchi removed his cap and handed it to a young staff officer, instructing him to deliver it to Yamaguchi's family. With final words of encouragement, the admiral sent the last evacuees over the side. In the darkness of June 5th, Japanese destroyer Makigumo drew in and fired 2 torpedoes into the crippled Hiryu to ensure her scuttling. One torpedo hit near the bow with a dull thud. Yet even that was not the immediate end. Amazingly, Hiryu remained afloat for several more hours, her shattered hulk refusing to sink. At 9:12 a.m. on June 5th, 1942, Hiryu sank beneath the waves, bow first. Yamaguchi, Kaku, and some 380 of Hiryu's officers and men went down with the ship. the last carrier standing at Midway was gone. The destruction of Hiryū marked the close of the carrier battles at Midway. With Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and now Hiryū lost, the Japanese First Air Fleet had suffered an irreplaceable blow. The 4 veteran fleet carriers that had spearheaded every major offensive since Pearl Harbor was gone in a single day. For the United States, her destruction ensured the decisive outcome of the battle. Hiryū's counterstrikes had crippled USS Yorktown, but her own loss left the Americans still in control of the seas. Midway showed how quickly fortunes could reverse in carrier warfare, where a single strike could erase years of preparation. Strategically, the loss of Hiryū and her sisters crippled Japan's ability to wage offensive carrier operations. Although carriers like Shōkaku and Zuikaku were still on the board, Japan lacked both the ships and the trained aviators to rebuild the striking force. The Imperial Navy would fight on, but never again with the same balance of strength it had carried into 1942. For Japan, Midway marked the turning of the tide. Hiryū's brief career thus stood as both a testament to Japan's naval aviation and a symbol of its limits. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, she fought with determination, even striking back when all others were lost. But, like her sisters, she could not escape the fate of sudden destruction in the crucible of carrier warfare. As the last Japanese carrier to fall at Midway, Hiryū remains a powerful reminder of the battle that changed the course of the Pacific War. Among the warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II, the heavy cruiser Mogami stands out for the string of misfortunes that plagued its career. From early construction flaws and storm damage to disastrous friendly fire incidents and collisions with its own fleetmates, Mogami earned a reputation as an unlucky ship well before its final, fateful engagement. In a navy that fielded many storied vessels, Mogami stands out as one of the unluckiest warships ever to sail under the rising sun. Mogami was the lead ship of a class of 4 cruisers built under the constraints of the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Officially designed as a light cruiser to stay within treaty limits, she was laid down in 1931 and launched in March 1934. In truth, Mogami and her sister ships were heavy cruisers in all but name. They displaced around 13,000 tons at full load and stretched over 650 feet in length. 4 powerful turbine engines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower drove Mogami to speeds up to 35 knots. Mogami's armament reflected Japan's intent to field a powerful warship secretly. As built, she carried 15 155mm 6.1-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, the maximum allowed for a light cruiser. She was soon refitted with 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, transforming her into a true heavy cruiser. She also carried a formidable torpedo armament, 4 triple launchers armed with the 24-inch Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. Despite her firepower and speed, Mogami's design had flaws. To save weight, her hull construction relied on extensive welding and a top-heavy layout. This made her structure less sturdy than intended. The ship's thick armor and heavy turrets raised her center of gravity, affecting stability. Early in her career, these issues would manifest with alarming consequences, foreshadowing the trouble that lay ahead. Mogami's misfortunes began almost immediately after commissioning. In September 1935, barely a few months into service, she encountered a powerful typhoon during fleet maneuvers, an event later known as the 4th Fleet Incident. Caught in raging seas, the cruiser's hull flexed and her bow suffered structural damage. Alarmingly, the crew discovered that sections of the hull had warped so badly that the turrets jammed, unable to rotate. Investigators blamed faulty welding techniques used in her construction to save weight. Mogami was ordered into dry dock for extensive reinforcement and reconstruction of her hull. This early mishap earned her a reputation as an unlucky ship among her crew. Despite this setback, Mogami was back in fighting form by the time Japan marched toward war in the Pacific. She and her sisters formed Cruiser Division 7 and provided heavy fire support for amphibious landings. In the invasion of Malaya and Borneo, Mogami's guns bombarded Allied positions to cover Japanese troop landings. She briefly tasted success without incident in these operations. However, the pattern of success would not last. Late on the night of February 28, 1942, Mogami was drawn into a fierce naval clash that would mark her with infamy, the Battle of Sunda Strait. Allied cruisers blundered into a convoy of Japanese troop transports near Java. Mogami, along with her sister ship Mikuma and other escorts, rushed to intercept the Allied ships before they could wreak havoc on the convoy. In the chaotic night battle that followed, Mogami's captain ordered a spread of 6 Type 93 torpedoes to be fired at the enemy cruisers. What happened next became a notorious episode of friendly fire. Mogami's long-lance salvo did score multiple devastating hits, but not on the Allied warships. Instead, in the confusion of battle, the torpedoes found Japanese targets. In a tragic irony, Mogami herself sank 5 of her own side's ships in that volley. The large army landing ship Ryujo Maru, 3 army transports loaded with troops and equipment, and a Navy minesweeper escort. One of those transports had been carrying Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the invading 16th Army. The general was pitched into the sea and nearly drowned. He was later rescued clinging to wreckage, his staff deciding it was better to let him believe the enemy was responsible. By the time the melee ended, Houston and Perth were overwhelmed and sunk by combined Japanese gunfire and torpedoes. But Mogami's inadvertent destruction of friendly vessels cast a pall over the victory. The Imperial Navy quietly apologized to the Army for the unfortunate incident, but within Mogami's ranks, her unlucky image only deepened. In one night, she had arguably caused more harm to Japan's own forces than the enemy did. Following the Sunda Strait debacle, Mogami continued to take part in Japan's early war operations, albeit now under wary eyes. In April 1942, she joined Admiral Nagumo's task force for the Indian Ocean raid. Together with Mikuma, she was tasked to hunt Allied merchant shipping in the Bay of Bengal. During this campaign, Mogami helped dispatch a few cargo steamers, adding some conventional successes to her record. However, these victories at sea were comparatively minor and did little to dispel the ship's growing jinx. Expected to be a decisive Japanese carrier victory. Instead, Japan's carrier fleet was annihilated on June 4th, and the invasion was cancelled. Kurita's cruisers received a belated recall order while they were already racing toward Midway at high speed. In the pre-dawn hours of June 5th, as they withdrew, the formation encountered the US submarine USS Tambor lurking ahead. Kurita signaled an abrupt emergency turn to avoid potential torpedoes. What ensued was a nightmarish misunderstanding within the Japanese line. The leading cruisers, Kumano and Suzuya, executed a 45-degree turn as ordered. The third ship, Mikuma, mistakenly turned a full 90 degrees. Mogami, following last in line, obeyed the original 45-degree turn, and suddenly found Mikuma broadside, dead ahead in the dark. It was too late to avoid disaster. Mogami rammed directly into Mikuma's port quarter at full cruising speed. The impact tore open Mikuma's hull and crumpled Mogami's bow like an accordion, up to 40 feet back. Both ships were grievously wounded by this single navigational error, a collision between sister ships in the middle of enemy waters. Mogami's forward section was bent and twisted, reducing her seaworthiness and limiting her speed to barely 12 knots. Mikuma, meanwhile, began leaking fuel oil but could still make way. Admiral Kurita, anxious to escape the submarine threat and rejoin the fleet, detached the 2 damaged cruisers with 2 destroyers and hurried ahead with the rest of his ships. The misfortune at Midway did not end with the collision. Daylight brought waves of American aircraft upon the limping Mogami and Mikuma. US Navy dive bombers caught the pair on June 6, 1942, and exacted a brutal toll. Mikuma was struck repeatedly by bombs, touching off a massive chain of explosions, likely from her own long-lance torpedoes, that turned the ship into a floating inferno. Mogami, too, was hit hard. Bombs smashed into her amidships, blasting one of her main turrets to scrap and starting fierce fires. One direct hit penetrated into Mogami's aft aircraft deck, the area once occupied by turret number 5, where it ignited a conflagration that swept through the compartments. Mogami's sickbay, filled with crew wounded from the collision, was engulfed by flames. In a desperate measure, her damage control teams had to seal off that section entirely to contain the blaze, knowing full well they were trapping injured shipmates inside. Mogami's crew fought heroically to save their ship, aided by the foresight of her damage control officer, who had earlier ordered all unused explosives and torpedoes dumped overboard to reduce fire risk. Still, by the time the air attacks ended, Mogami was badly mauled. Scores of her sailors lay dead, and fires smouldering within. For Mikuma, there was no salvation. She sank beneath the waves that afternoon, becoming the first Japanese cruiser lost in the war. Mogami, by extraordinary effort and a measure of luck, survived the Midway ordeal. Battered and burned, she limped away under escort. Her survival was due in part to the jettisoned torpedoes, which prevented even more catastrophic explosions, and the crew's frantic repair work amidst bomb hits. Mogami managed to reach the large Japanese naval base at Truk for emergency patching, and later steamed back to Japan for full repairs. She spent many months from late 1942 into mid-1943, having her bow rebuilt and systems restored. It was during this lengthy refit that the Imperial Navy decided to implement the unique conversion of Mogami into an aircraft-carrying cruiser. By April 1943, Mogami emerged from the yard with a clean, stubby bow, replacing her twisted forend, and an extended flight deck ready to carry reconnaissance floatplanes. This rebuild temporarily removed her from combat during the critical battles around Guadalcanal. A stroke of luck, perhaps, given how many Japanese warships were sunk in those engagements. But as soon as Mogami rejoined the fleet, her unlucky streak resumed. Barely back in service, Mogami literally ran into trouble again. On May 22, 1943, while conducting training and trials in Tokyo Bay, she collided with a fleet oiler, the tanker Toa Maru. This peacetime accident was minor. Mogami sustained only slight damage, but it did nothing to improve her notoriety. The heavy cruiser's very first outing after reconstruction ended with yet another collision. After quick repairs, Mogami was on hand at Hashirajima anchorage on June 8, 1943, when disaster struck a different ship. The mighty battleship Mutsu, moored not far away, suffered a massive magazine explosion and sank suddenly. Mogami's crew hurried to send boats to search for survivors in the water, but found none. Although Mogami was blameless in the Mutsu tragedy, being so near yet helpless to assist added another unhappy footnote to her service that year. In mid-1943, the Allies began pushing back in the Pacific, and Mogami was pressed into frontline duty again. In July, she helped transport Japanese Army reinforcements to the beleaguered garrison at Rabaul in the South Pacific. She then operated out of Truk and Rabaul, responding to Allied thrusts in the Solomon Islands. On November 5, 1943, Mogami's bad luck nearly caught up with her fatally during an American carrier air raid. Moored in the harbour with other cruisers, she came under attack from US Navy dive bombers from the carrier USS Saratoga. One 500-pound bomb struck Mogami near her forward turrets. The explosion tore into her upper deck and sparked a severe fire, killing 19 crewmen and threatening to detonate her own magazines. For hours, her crew fought the blaze amid billowing smoke. Ultimately, they succeeded in saving the ship, but Mogami was left badly scarred once again. She now required substantial repairs to her forward section due to the bombing. Mogami withdrew to Truk for temporary fixes, and then to Kure by the year's end. In early 1944, she received further refits, including additional anti-aircraft guns to cope with the intensifying aerial threat. By now, all 4 of the Mogami-class cruisers had seen heavy action, and Mogami herself had endured more than her share of near disasters. Despite everything, Mogami sailed on into 1944, a veteran ship with scarred hull plates and a wary crew. In June, she took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, serving in a rearguard force during Japan's ill-fated attempt to defend the Mariana Islands. Mogami emerged from that battle unscathed. The fighting mainly involved aircraft, and her force did not bear the brunt of the action. Afterward, she underwent one more upgrade in Japan, more anti-aircraft guns and radar, in preparation for the decisive battles everyone knew were coming. By the autumn of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered virtually all its remaining capital ships for a last-ditch effort to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. The operation would culminate in the massive confrontation known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Mogami was assigned to the Southern Force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. This force, including 2 old battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, Mogami as the lone cruiser, and a handful of destroyers, was tasked with a night attack up Surigao Strait at the southern approach to Leyte Gulf. It was essentially a suicide mission. Nishimura's squadron was to charge through the narrow strait and attack the Allied invasion fleet, while other Japanese forces engaged elsewhere. As Mogami set sail for this operation, one can imagine the mood aboard. The odds were long, and Mogami's crew were well aware of the ship's unlucky past. Still, they steamed forward dutifully into what would be their final trial by fire. In the pre-dawn hours of October 25, 1944, Mogami entered the confined waters of Surigao Strait at the forefront of one of World War II's last classic naval battles. The American Navy, under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, lay in ambush with a line of battleships and cruisers blocking the north end of the strait. As Nishimura's force pushed through, they were assailed first by American PT boats and then by destroyers launching torpedoes. The Japanese formation was thrown into confusion even before facing the main enemy lineup. In the darkness and chaos, Mogami experienced yet another cruel twist of fate. She was hit by friendly fire from her own side. The Japanese battleship Fuso, having sustained torpedo damage and unsure of what targets loomed ahead, mistook Mogami for an enemy ship crossing her path. Fuso opened fire briefly on this shadowy silhouette. Shells from Fuso's secondary guns struck Mogami, one of them tearing into the cruiser's forward superstructure. The errant salvo killed several sailors aboard Mogami. The fog of war had made Mogami a victim of her allies once more, at the worst possible moment. Pressing on, Mogami and the surviving Japanese ships next charged into the American battle line around 3:50 a.m. Columns of water and blinding gun flashes filled the night as Admiral Oldendorf's warships unleashed broadsides. Yamashiro, the lead battleship, was caught in a deadly crossfire of heavy shells and was soon mortally hit. Mogami, following behind, initially evaded some torpedoes and tried to return fire. With Yamashiro drawing the Americans' focus, Mogami's crew managed to launch a salvo of their own torpedoes into the darkness, but these found no targets. Within minutes, Yamashiro was sunk, and the full fury of the US Navy turned on Mogami. Under overlapping barrages from multiple American cruisers and battleships, Mogami was pummeled brutally. An 8-inch shell, likely from USS Portland or another heavy cruiser, struck her bridge and demolished it, wiping out the command team, along with most of the bridge staff. Another shell destroyed Mogami's air defense center. In the span of moments, the ship was left leaderless and half blind, still moving, but effectively out of control. Amid the carnage, the chief gunnery officer eventually assumed command, but by then, Mogami was simply fighting for survival. On fire and listing, Mogami attempted to withdraw southward, trying to escape the strait. What followed was one final, almost unbelievable stroke of ill luck. As Mogami limped away from the American line, Admiral Kiyohide Shima's second Japanese force, a separate group that had been following Nishimura, was arriving from the south. Shima's flagship, the heavy cruiser Nachi, suddenly loomed out of the darkness, directly on a collision course with the damaged Mogami. Despite desperate helm orders on both ships, the inevitable occurred at about 4:25 a.m. Nachi rammed into Mogami's starboard side. The two Japanese cruisers ripped into each other with a grinding crash. Mogami's already battered hull gained a fresh 15-meter gash. Nachi lost her structural integrity and had mountings torn off. The collision further crippled Mogami. It jammed her remaining steering gear and added new flooding. Incredibly, Mogami had now collided with friendly cruisers twice in her career, each time under dire circumstances. The crew fought stubbornly to control flooding and douse fires, even jettisoning remaining torpedoes to prevent them from cooking off. 4 of those torpedoes did explode in the water as they were dumped, rocking the ship yet again. By dawn, Mogami had somehow made it out of Surigao Strait into the open sea, but her ordeal was not over. As daylight broke on October 25th, the final blows fell. US carrier aircraft from escort carriers soon spotted the lone, smouldering cruiser. Waves of torpedo bombers swooped in. Struck by bombs and a torpedo, Mogami's agony was prolonged. 1 torpedo hit on her port side, and several bomb impacts left her dead in the water, with raging fires that could not be contained. The valiant crew kept up damage control as long as humanly possible, but the ship was beyond saving. By mid-morning, after 3 hours of relentless punishment, Mogami's survivors gathered on the decks, many in tears, and leapt or climbed down to awaiting rescue boats. The destroyer, Akebono, miraculously still nearby amid the chaos, closed in to take off the crew. At 12:40 p.m., once Akebono had rescued as many men as possible, including virtually all who were still alive aboard Mogami, the destroyer fired a single long-lance torpedo into the crippled cruiser's hull. The powerful warhead detonated amidships, and Mogami began to capsize. With one final, thunderous explosion, the blackened hulk of Mogami slipped beneath the waves of the Mindanao Sea at 1:07 on October 25, 1944. Of Mogami's approximately 850 crew, about 700 survived by clambering onto Akebono and other craft. Around 150 officers and sailors perished in the final battle, lost either in the furious combat or going down with the ship. The destruction of Mogami at Surigao Strait marked the end of a tumultuous career, one that, in hindsight, seemed almost cursed. In the space of 9 years, Mogami had endured a typhoon that deformed her, caused one of the worst friendly fire incidents of the war, collided catastrophically with 2 of her own fleet's cruisers, accidentally rammed a tanker, been bombed, shelled, and finally torpedoed into the depths. None of Mogami's sister ships survived the war either. The entire Mogami class met violent ends, a testament to the ferocity of the Pacific War, and perhaps to the overambitious design that had given them such checkered starts. In Mogami's final battle, there were poignant footnotes that underscored her ill-starred fate. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, who commanded the American fleet that annihilated Mogami's force at Surigao, had in peacetime been a captain of the very cruiser USS Houston, the same Houston that Mogami helped sink at Sunda Strait in 1942. By an irony of history, Oldendorf was, in effect, avenging his old command by orchestrating the destruction of Mogami. Another consequence of Mogami's last moments was the plight of the cruiser Nachi, the fleet flagship that collided with her. Nachi, heavily damaged from the collision, had to withdraw to port for repairs, only to be caught and sunk by US carrier aircraft a few days later near Manila. In that sense, Mogami's bad luck seemed almost contagious to the end, dragging down another ship with her. Warships often earn glory for great victories or innovations, but Mogami became famous, or infamous, for the string of calamities that befell her. Her legacy is that of the luckless cruiser. While other Japanese ships certainly met worse individual fates, and many fought valiantly in lost causes, none experienced the sheer number of accidents and ill luck that Mogami did over her career. From accidentally killing compatriots to literally falling apart under Mother Nature's fury, Mogami's saga seems almost beyond belief. Stripped of context, Mogami's service record might read like a comedy of errors, but for the men who served on her, each misfortune was paid in blood and sacrifice. Mogami truly lived up to her title as Japan's most ill-fated ship, a vessel that, despite the best efforts of her builders and crew, never could escape the shadow of misfortune that followed her from commission to its final battle. In the final year of World War II, as Japan faced mounting defeats across the Pacific, the Imperial Navy turned to increasingly desperate measures. Among the most haunting was the Kaiten, a human-guided torpedo packed with explosives and steered by a lone pilot towards certain death. Conceived as a last-ditch weapon to slow the Allied advance, the Kaiten demanded not just skill, but complete sacrifice. This is the story of those young men who volunteered, trained, and ultimately died within the steel hulls of their torpedoes, not as reckless fanatics, but as products of a collapsing empire willing to spend its youth in the name of duty. Explore the dark path of a typical Kaiten pilot, from recruitment and indoctrination, through rigorous training, to a mission from which there was no return. Japan's leaders conceived the Kaiten in 1944, desperate for a miracle weapon. With Allied forces pushing closer, naval commanders resurrected earlier ideas of suicide craft. Manned suicide planes, kamikazes, had already begun, and now the Navy's engineers re-envisioned the deadly torpedo. Official development began in February 1944, and by late July, the first Kaiten prototype was complete. The Type 1 Kaiten, essentially a modified Type 93 Long Lance torpedo fitted with a tiny cockpit, became the standard model. Within months, hundreds of these human-guided torpedoes were built for the war effort. At first, the idea of a human torpedo was controversial even in Japan. Commanders debated whether victory might still be achieved by conventional means. But as 1944 wore on and fuel, food, and ships dwindled for Japan, desperation won out. In July 1944, the Navy formally adopted the Kaiten Program. In practice, roughly 330 Type 1 Kaiten were produced, and over 100 were deployed in operations. Several other Kaiten types were designed, but none saw actual combat. From the start, only volunteer or specially selected young men were sent into the torpedoes. The average Kaiten pilot was not an elite admiral or an old veteran, but an ordinary sailor in his late teens or early 20s. In fact, almost all were between 17 and 28 years old. Many had served on submarines or destroyers before being chosen. They usually stood 5 feet 5 inches, the height of the cockpit, and were physically fit enough to endure cramped quarters. Recruitment intensified as the war situation became more dire. Young sailors across Japan were screened by the Navy's elite forces, and those deemed capable were accepted into the new special attack units to carry out this final, fatal duty. Ideology and duty were hammered into these recruits from day one. The Kaiten Program was steeped in the same ultranationalist propaganda that had inspired the kamikaze airmen. Officers reminded them of the samurai heritage and the imperial war code. As one Kaiten trainee later recalled, his instructors were surprisingly informal and fatherly, helping the men accept their fate. But beneath the outward calm was fierce conviction. They lived by phrases like, "Death is as light as a feather, duty as heavy as a mountain." Many wore a white hachimaki headband, embroidered with the imperial sun, and carried a short ceremonial sword or dagger, linking them to the warrior past. In a widely recorded ceremony before the first mission, a vice admiral personally handed each Kaiten pilot a sword, to be kept for victory, or to be used for ritual suicide in defeat. In the hours before departure, each man knelt at a small shrine, on his submarine, to pray, and left letters or poems for loved ones. They donned plain dark jumpsuits and their headbands. In the telling words of one post-war writer, they viewed themselves as elite even in this ultimate sacrifice. In reality, they were frightened young men trying to live up to impossible expectations. Training a Kaiten pilot was a slow, exacting grind. At a remote naval station on Otsushima Island, in Japan's inland sea, the Navy built a special training camp complete with launch ramps, test pits, and calm, shallow waters. Here the recruits learned to drive by periscope and instruments alone, simulating the blindness of underwater navigation. First, they crewed high-speed surface boats, practicing maneuvers solely by dashboard readings. Once they mastered that, they graduated to the training Kaitens, torpedoes fitted with dummy, non-explosive warheads, and a safety ballast that could blow them to surface in emergencies. Early drills were simple. Circle around a visible buoy or island at slow speed, learning the feel of steering and trim. As their skill grew, instructors introduced hazards, low-speed runs around rocky islets, or fast runs through narrow channels, both by day and under dim light. Pilots had to surface frequently to scope out the landscape, adjusting depth and ballast as their oxygen supply lightened the weight of the craft. Nighttime exercises taught them to navigate only by instruments and the faint moon above. Trim adjustments were particularly tricky. As the hydrogen peroxide fuel burned off, the Kaiten became lighter, demanding constant correction. Final exercises were performed in open ocean. The pilots rode in unarmed Kaitens, launched from a submerged mother submarine, honing attack runs on target ships at full speed, up to 40 knots. These maneuvers were deadly. Colliding with a target, even at test speed, could crumple the torpedo's bow and hurl the pilot into the water. In fact, at least 15 pilots died in training accidents. One of these was Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki, a co-designer of the Kaiten. As the months passed, the pilots saw that these suicide exercises were not exaggeration. Every mission would be a one-way trip. Between drills, daily life for a Kaiten pilot was tense and cramped. Most lived on their submarines or at remote barracks near the training base. The schedules were strict. Wake before dawn for inspection of the torpedoes, hours at the simulator pool, meals of rice and fish eaten silently in a mess hall. There was little to say, except in hushed tones, and each man kept a small bundle of personal items, photos of family or a letter, tucked in his uniform. Strict discipline coexisted with a strange camaraderie. They were all in this together. Psychologically, they were always hovering between fear and resolve. Officially, no amount of fear or doubt was tolerated. Surrender was taboo. They were taught from childhood that retreating was dishonorable. Still, many confided in each other that they were scared. Some tried to steel themselves by reading patriotic poetry or the writings of wartime authors who glorified sacrifice. One surviving pilot noted that instructors treated them kindly, almost parentally, perhaps to help them accept the idea of honorable death as a privilege rather than a punishment. When weeks passed without orders, tension mounted. Pilots would often stare at the stills of water through the periscope or out a boat hatch, wondering if this would be the night. Rumors flew of imminent attacks or news of other kamikaze missions far away. Some believed reaching an enemy carrier would redeem Japan. Others feared being sent to explode against a floating fuel barge. At any time, they could be told to suit up and board the Kaiten waiting for them. Inside a Kaiten, conditions were suffocating. The pilot sat in a tiny cylindrical space barely larger than his body. The cramped compartment smelled of oil, seawater, and the pungent chemicals of the peroxide engine. Its air supply was limited. A clean air tank gave enough oxygen for only about 30 minutes. Thereafter, a primitive filter of solid sodium peroxide had to scrub the carbon dioxide. Noise was constant. The roar of the torpedo's engine, the creaks of the hull, and the heartbeat of a young man rising under stress. Each pilot understood the craft well. He had controls to start the motor, to turn the rudder, and even a lever to detonate the warhead or blow the craft's air ballast if captured. But the pilot had no way out. All early designs that had included an escape hatch were altered so the cockpit locked from the outside. In short, they were in a sealed coffin with an engine. When a Kaiten squadron finally went into action, every detail was planned for one goal: striking a worthy enemy ship. Kaiten were never launched from shore in combat, except in one late case. They were carried on the decks of special submarines. These mother subs were modified with cradles on top to hold 2, 4, or even 6 human torpedoes. In most operations, a submarine carried 4 Kaiten, each with a pilot inside. When ready, the submarine's crew would surface at night, often just miles from the target, open small hatches, and each pilot would climb through an access tube into his torpedo. The hatch behind him was sealed and locked. The crew of the sub set the internal gyroscope of each Kaiten to the rough bearing of a target ship. Then the Kaitens were rolled overboard. The sub might stay submerged for these launches, but once a Kaiten was in the water, the pilot was on his own. The torpedo's motor would begin propelling him forward. Using the little periscope and his trained instinct, the pilot navigated quietly toward the enemy anchorage or convoy. Ideally, the Kaiten surfaced only briefly when still distant, long enough to check bearings. This was the most dangerous moment, as radar or lookouts could spot a bobbing torpedo. After confirming the location, the pilot resubmerged, armed the 4-ton warhead, and headed in for the attack run at full speed. From accounts, we know they aimed for a ship's side. A well-timed crash would rupture hull and ignite fuel stores. If the Kaiten hit, the warhead exploded catastrophically. If the pilot missed at first, he could try again, but if no target appeared, his only other choice was to manually detonate the warhead and die on the spot. In essence, each pilot had surrendered the very choice of life or death. As one wartime report dryly noted, if the mission failed, he would detonate his vessel as a last resort. The very first operational use came on the night of the 20th of November 1944, near Ulithi Atoll. The Japanese sent 2 subs with 4 Kaiten each into the American anchorage. In that attack, one Kaiten, piloted by Lieutenant Sekio Nishina, fatally struck the oiler USS Mississauga, causing a massive explosion. For a few dramatic moments, Tokyo Radio declared victory, even claiming several warships sunk. In reality, only the Mississauga went down, and 2 other Kaiten from that attack were quickly destroyed. One rammed by a destroyer, another beached on a reef. All 3 pilots had perished. Subsequent Kaiten operations followed similarly tragic patterns. Submarines prowled off Ulithi, Guam, Okinawa, and Leyte with their precious human torpedoes. Occasionally, a Kaiten found its mark. In July 1945, one salvo sank the destroyer escort USS Underhill, killing over 100 men. In another attack, an American landing craft, LCI-600, was destroyed. But these successes came at a dire cost to the Japanese. By early 1945, it was clear the Kaiten would not turn the tide. US forces grew adept at anti-submarine warfare. They hunted and destroyed the Kaiten-carrying submarines almost as soon as they launched. In fact, many submarines were lost before their pilots could fire. For example, submarine I-37 was sunk by destroyers near the Philippines, with all 117 aboard, including 4 ready-to-launch Kaiten pilots. Another, I-370, was sunk with all 84 hands after a radar-equipped aircraft detected it. In total, historians tally 8 Japanese submarines lost on Kaiten missions, costing roughly 846 crewmen. The Kaiten pilots themselves rarely survived. Of the roughly 100 men who rode out on combat missions, only 2 are recorded to have returned alive. Overall, 106 Kaiten pilots died on operational missions. A further 15 died in training or accidents. In comparison, their weapons scored almost no targets. According to the Allies, the only definitive sinkings were the Mississiniwa, Underhill, and LC-600. A few other Allied ships were damaged, but never critically. However, the total number of ships sunk by Kaitens is believed to be between 40 and 50, although the only ones of any note were the three mentioned. One post-war American summary flatly called the Kaiten effort a miserable failure despite the pilots' courage. Within Japan, the human toll did not go unnoticed. Even before the war ended, memorial services were quietly held. Surviving submariners spoke of the empty bunks of their Kaiten comrades. With the distance of time, historians see the Kaiten as a tragic footnote to the Pacific War. It was a weapon born of desperation, a bloody symbol of how far a nation would go to try to avert defeat. But the human story remains most vivid. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Kaiten program had cost the lives of over 100 young pilots and the crews of 8 submarines. Its limited tactical success was clear even to Japan's naval command. Though several ships had been damaged or destroyed by Kaiten, including USS Mississiniwa and USS Underhill, the weapon had failed to alter the course of the war. It became one of many desperate measures taken in the final months, a symbol not of strength, but of the extent of sacrifice Japan was willing to demand of even its youngest servicemen. In the weeks that followed the surrender, the remaining Kaiten craft were scrapped, their mother submarines surrendered to Allied forces. At Otsushima and other bases, abandoned training equipment rusted in place, a quiet testament to the rushed nature of the program and its hasty end. Surviving naval officers gave testimony about Kaiten operations during Allied interrogations, confirming what little the outside world already suspected, that these suicide weapons were not a decisive secret weapon, but the product of dwindling options. For the families of those who perished, the war's end brought little clarity. Many had been told their sons died with honor in battle, but the details were vague or withheld entirely. In some cases, the pilots' last letters arrived weeks after the surrender, delivered by naval couriers still performing their duties. Memorial services were held quietly in temples and villages, often without official recognition. Within the former Navy itself, the Kaiten units were remembered with a somber pride. Submarine crews who had launched them mourned the loss of their fellow sailors. Officers who had trained or selected the pilots offered their own accounts, most often emphasizing the volunteers' sense of duty and resolve, and rarely the politics that had driven the weapon's creation. By the late 1940s, the remnants of the Kaiten program had already faded from public attention, buried beneath the broader devastation of the war and the reconstruction that followed. But for those who had witnessed the launches, or served aboard the launch submarines, the memory remained clear. A weapon born of desperation, guided by human hands towards certain death. In the end, these young pilots achieved neither a decisive victory nor even survival, but they left behind a haunting legacy of duty and loss that history will not soon erase.